And welcome to the 19th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. This morning we're taking evidence from a panel of witnesses on the financial sustainability of Scotland's universities. And can I welcome to the meeting Professor Sue Rigby, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Edinburgh Napier University, Claire Macpherson, Director, Universities Scotland, Professor Sir Peter Matheson, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, and Professor James A. Miller, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West of Scotland. Thank you all for joining us today, and we're going to go straight to questions. And can I begin my questions with you, Sir Peter? Sir Peter, can you tell me what's your salary as Principal of the University of Edinburgh? Sorry, we'll just wait. Your microphone's not on.
Okay. That working now?
Yep.
Yeah. The figure that's often quoted in the press is something around £400,000 a year. I don't scrutinise my slips, so I don't know the exact figure. I don't think it's quite as high as that, but I'm certainly very well paid.
Well, let's stop there. If you cannot answer a basic question of your salary, then we're going to have a very difficult meeting today. So tell me, how much do you get paid as Principal of the University of Edinburgh?
I'd have to get my P60 out to show it to you, and as I say, I don't carry that figure around in my head. I recognise that I'm very well paid.
You're the highest paid principal in Scotland?
That's open to dispute, I think. There might be
right, well,
one.
dispute it with me. Tell me who's paid more than you.
I'm told that the principal of the University of Stirling has had a pay rise recently that takes him above me, but again, I don't look at people's pay packets.
Okay. So is your basic salary in the region of £418,000 when you add in the total package, the salary and other things?
The basic salary, I think, is about £350,000, and then there's a pension, because I'm not a member of the pension scheme, there's a pension supplement.
Mm-hmm. So would you say around the £418,000 figure?
That's a figure that's often quoted.
Did you get a 5% pay rise last year?
I did.
Did you get a 2.5% pay rise in January of this year?
I did.
Yeah. And on top of all that, you still don't know how much you're being paid, just it's a lot of money. Sorry, could you answer the question?
I stand by what everybody said.
Okay. Do you get paid more than the First Minister of Scotland?
I don't know the details, but again, that's something that's often said in the media.
Okay. You do, well, I'll say you do get paid more than the First Minister of Scotland. Do you get paid more than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
Again, I don't know what people get paid, but that's often something that's said.
Okay. Is it often said, because I have the figures here, that you get paid more than the combined total of the First Minister of Scotland and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
Can I give you another comparison?
Well, if you answer that, and then you can give whatever comparison you want, if you can defend this.
Well, you've got the figures in front of you, I don't, so yeah. I assume you're reflecting the truth. The other thing I did was an equally fatuous comparison, is that I Googled organisations with a £1.4 billion turnover and looked at the CEO salaries, and for one of them it was £5 million, and for the other one it was £17 million.
So do you think you should be on somewhere between 5 and 17 million? Is that where you set your...
No, I was made an offer by the University of Edinburgh when I was appointed, and I accepted it, and I'm very satisfied with the package that I was offered.
Do you think you're doing more than the First Minister of Scotland and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to deserve to be paid more than them?
I think if pay was judged by what people deserve, then the numbers would probably be very different.
So you don't deserve the salary you're on?
I think I was made an offer and I accepted it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, given the massive cuts you're overseeing in the University of Edinburgh, that an area that we could see a reduction is in your salary?
Well, again, I've made the point in discussions about senior team pay that you could pay the senior team at the University of Edinburgh nothing, and it would make almost no difference to the size of the expenditure challenge that we face.
You're getting quite close to £500,000 a year just with yourself. It would make a bit of a difference. Sorry, if you can answer questions rather than just shrugging or nodding.
Well, I thought a nod was yes. I mean,
well, no, because we need it for the official report.
I see. So we have senior team pay in British universities, including the University of Edinburgh, which is high. We recognise that. It's high compared to other employees of the institution. I completely recognise that. And I recognise that people feel that there's a question of whether those salaries are earned or not. But my position is that when I was appointed to this job, I was made an offer by the Remuneration Committee, which is an independent committee of the university, of which I'm not a member, and my predecessor was not a member. They made me an offer, I accepted it.
But since then, you don't even know how much you're on?
I don't know the precise numbers.
No,
I think
that's
quite
telling in itself. Tell me a bit about this restructuring plan and the £140 million you need to save.
What would you like to know?
Well, how did it get to 140 million? What has gone wrong up until now, and do you bear any responsibility for the failures of the deficit you're now having to oversee the reversal of?
So it's not a deficit. We are not in deficit. The University of Edinburgh's expenditure is higher than its income, and the sources...
Would that not lead to a deficit?
If we don't do anything, yes, precisely. That's precisely the point.
So it's just in the last few months, or just in the run-up to February when you announced these plans, that this became an issue?
No.
OK, well, I'm still puzzled then. If it's not a deficit, and because you've got such large reserves...
A deficit means at the end of your year accounts, you're publishing a position where your income your expenditure has exceeded your income. We're not in that position.
But because of a projected deficit, then, you are seeking to make changes that will reduce your costs of £140 million.
If we did nothing, the University of Edinburgh would be projected to be in deficit next year in 25-26, and that's in keeping with about 70% of British universities and probably a higher percentage than that of Scottish universities.
Do you share all your financial disclosures with campus trade unions as you're required to by law?
We do.
So why are the campus unions telling us, and you've seen a copy of this correspondence, that campus trade unions have still not received adequate financial disclosure as required by law? Why are they telling us that?
There was a meeting last week with our campus trade unions where they were given all the information that we're able to give, and they acknowledged in that meeting that this was the most financial disclosure they can remember in their memory.
Well, the most is different from all. And the most in memory could be just one extra page from what they were previously given. Sorry, I'll finish my question first. You had that meeting last week, but it was on Friday. We as a committee, Thursday or Friday, we received this document from them, which their third point is they have still not received adequate financial disclosure as required by law. So are they not being truthful with this committee, or are you?
It's not for me to comment on whether they're being truthful or not. I think we've given them all the information that we're able to give them that's not commercially sensitive, and they have acknowledged the receipt of that information. We were surprised by that letter in the light of the remarks that they had made, some of them had made, at the meeting that happened just before that letter was sent.
So the commercially sensitive information, would that allow them to look more at the jobs that are under threat and the numbers of jobs that are under threat?
We haven't specifically put any individual jobs under threat. What we're seeking to do is reduce our expenditure, and the 140 million that you quoted is about 90 million of staff and about 50 million of non-staff.
Is that proportionate then? That 90 million of 140 million being borne by losing staff, is that proportionate to the cost of the university?
Proportionate to of our expenditure that is on staff. So
yes,
about
compared to capital, for example, which has also been mentioned.
Yes.
Could you meet your requirements, and many others question that, could you meet your requirements for savings by spending less on capital?
No.
No, not at all.
Well, we're spending less on capital. We're seeking to revise our capital programme in the light of what's affordable.
So you are seeking to revise it. You could spend less.
Yeah, but that's not what you asked me. You asked me, could I meet the 140 million by just spending capital?
No, I said, could you meet... I didn't say that at all, Sir Peter. I said, of the 140 million, could you meet more of that by spending less on capital and protecting some jobs?
And the answer is no, because the 140 million is recurrent expenditure, and capital expenditure is not capital expenditure.
But there is a cost to capital expenditure if you're borrowing for that.
There is, that's true.
So, if you have to borrow less money because you do less capital, there is a lower recurring cost.
The only way to put the University of Edinburgh back onto a sustainable footing is to reduce our recurrent expenditure. 58% of our recurrent expenditure is on staff.
Two key committees in charge of overseeing the university's capital spending have not published minutes of their meetings for the last 5 years. Do you agree with that statement?
We don't know which two committees they're talking about. The two committees.
How many committees do you have that look at university capital spending?
The two senior university committees that look at capital spending are the Court and the Policy and Resources Committee, and we're required to publish the minutes of those meetings, and we do so, and we're up to date on that.
Okay. Have the Court requested you or your exec to present any alternatives to your proposals for the 140 million?
We've had lots of discussions with the Court and the Executive going back 2 years about.
So have they asked for alternatives?
We've had lots of discussion about what the alternatives are.
Have they asked for alternatives?
We've had lots of discussions about what the
possible
possible
Sir Peter,
plans are.
I can do this all day if you want to, but the question is very clear. Have they asked for alternatives? Are they unhappy with what you put forward, or have they rubber-stamped it and said what Sir Peter is saying is what we're going to do?
And I'm going to continue to answer it in the way that I have, which is that in formulation of a financial plan, we develop a plan, we present it to the Policy and Resources Committee and to the Court for their approval, and in that approval there's often discussion about what's the priority, why are we doing this, what are the risks. All of that discussion has been happening for a couple of years, and they have approved our plans.
And did they change any of it?
Not the gist of it, no.
So the court were quite happy to rubber stamp your £140 million savings and the impact that will have £90 million being saved by a reduction in staff.
I doubt if they would describe it as a rubber stamp.
But they agreed to £90 million being saved by staffing reductions at the University of Edinburgh.
Yes.
Yep. What about the Senate, the University Senate and their no confidence vote? What cognizance do you make of that?
It represents very strong opinions held at Senate and real concerns about the things that we're doing and the possible impacts of them, and we're respectful of that.
And so what do? You're respectful by not changing anything?
We're respectful by trying to engage them in understanding why we're doing what we're doing and how to make sure that we mitigate the risks.
Mm-hmm. But they believe there are other ways to meet the challenges the university is facing.
Well, they haven't suggested any.
So they've suggested nothing at all?
No.
No? And the unions have suggested nothing at all?
The unions obviously would prefer to avoid job losses. That's very much their mission. And again,
would you not prefer to avoid job losses?
We've already had some job losses, as you know, with the voluntary severance scheme.
Yeah.
And we're seeking, we would very much hope that if there are further job losses, they can be achieved by voluntary means as well. And that's what we discussed with the trade unions. They'd like us to rule out compulsory redundancies. We have not done so because we genuinely don't know whether they're going to be necessary, and it would be dishonest to pretend that we do know.
So to meet your aspirations to save £140 million, 90 million from staffing, how many jobs will have to go over and above the 350 that have already left the university?
We don't know the answer to that because it depends entirely which jobs are focused. Obviously, we have staff paid a wide range of
some very high, like yourself.
Indeed.
Yeah. But to save 90 million, roughly how many will have to go?
We haven't done that calculation.
You must have a rough figure. You'll have to have an approximation.
Well, I can tell you that 350 people that have gone under voluntary severance has yielded us a net saving of £18 million. And in the people that have gone under that scheme, there's a disproportionate number of lower paid staff. We haven't had many higher paid staff in that scheme.
But ultimately...
So transposing from those numbers to the bigger figure is not the correct way to calculate it.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, if you're going to save 90 million, when you're going to the court and you're being scrutinised, even though they didn't change anything, they must have asked you, how many job losses, Sir Peter, do you think this is going to entail?
They haven't actually asked that question because
they didn't ask that question.
Well, we've made it very public that we're not able to give a number, and the calculations that people are trying to extrapolate from the voluntary severance scheme are not the accurate way to do it.
But surely people are only trying to extrapolate those numbers because you're not able to offer them. No, if you are saying that your university is going to spend £90 million less on staff,
yes,
you must be able to know roughly how many fewer staff you will have.
There are various ways you could try and calculate a number, and you could do it by average salaries, but that would be inaccurate in the sense that we don't know whether that's the correct number, the correct jobs to identify that which we might lose. We're aiming to run the university in a different way. We've got 5 work streams, as you may know, to address this. And we're seeking to reduce our staff base. We've made that very clear. The number of staff that we employ needs to go down. Where those changes will be and which staff will be affected will depend on the outcome of the work streams. It'll then depend on discussions with individual staff members, with trade unions. So it would be quite false to pretend that I know who it's going to be or how many.
I would suggest it's rather false to pretend that you know that you can save £90 million if you don't even know which jobs are going to be lost. Can I ask you, do you accept any responsibility for the financial difficulties the University of Edinburgh finds itself in?
Yes, so of course I'm the Chief Executive, and I've been the Chief Executive during the last 7.5 years. The circumstances have changed in the last 2 or 3 years, and there have been some of the things which are within our control and some of the things which are not. Mm-hmm. We're seeking to address those parts of it which are within our control.
So which elements of it are you to blame for?
Well, I don't like the idea of blame. I think we're responsible.
Well,
we're accountable to the governing body.
Which areas of loss in the University of Edinburgh, where you are having to now find funding to fill gaps, are you responsible for?
So
what have you done wrong as principal that has led to some of the financial troubles your university is finding itself in?
Well, I don't accept the premise that I'm to blame or that I've done wrong or that my senior team have done wrong.
Responsibility.
Yes, and what we've done is we've presided over a situation where we're now taking preemptive action to try and make sure that the university remains in a sustainable position. We're not waiting to be in deficit before we do it. So we're taking. That's why I think the court has been responsive to our plans, is that we're seeking to we're doing what we describe as a course correction, trying to make sure the university does not end up in deficit, does not end up unable to serve its mission.
And potentially thousands of staff.
Say that again.
By losing potentially hundreds or thousands of staff.
By reducing our expenditure to a level that's sustainable and compatible with our income.
So were you wrong to have employed all these staff for the last few years?
Well, I think at the time these staff were being employed, the projections around international student numbers, it's particularly about international student numbers. I'm sure we'll have further discussion about that topic. And the projection...
I know, and we will. And that's something that is somewhat out with your control, but it depends in terms of other aspects of it. But you are the principal. You are extremely well paid, even though you don't know yourself how much you get paid. Tell us something you've got wrong in the past that you now regret as university principal that has led to some of the problems your university is now facing.
So I don't accept the premise that I've
got
something...
anything wrong.
If you allow me to answer, can I answer your question? Can I answer your question, please?
Yeah, but
please.
While answering the question, tell me about the people and money rollout. Was that a mistake?
Can I please answer your question about so the university budgets itself and plans its income projections based on a number of factors, one of which is international student recruitment. And 2 years ago, we realised that our international student recruitment, our income, some of it's about numbers, some of it's about tariffs, the price, the sticker price, if you like. We realised 2 years ago that we'd not achieved the targets that we'd set. So we fell short by about £20 million. That then becomes a recurrent shortfall in our 5-year budget. And then at that time, it was not clear whether or not this was a one-off effect of some of the policy statements that were being made by the Westminster government and or other aspects of geopolitics. 1 year ago, we saw more or less the same thing. Again, we saw a shortfall of tuition fee income by about £20 million. So that now becomes 40 million cumulative. At that point, we intervened, and you say it's slightly beyond my control about international student recruitment. All of the University of Edinburgh is a very devolved organisation. All admissions decisions are made at school and programme level. We then collate the figures, and the figures are presented to us. So it was clear that we were not achieving the budgeted income targets. At the same time, we were able, and I'll come to People and Money, which you mentioned, but through People and Money, we now have really fantastic access to numbers of staff data that we didn't have before. And at a touch of a button, we can see what's happening to our staff right across the university. And we saw in the last 2 years, there was growth of staff groups, both in terms of numbers and in terms of cost, right across the university. So this is commensurate with increasing numbers of students, but the increasing numbers of students had flattened off. So there was a mismatch. And that's when we intervened with what we've called staff recruitment restraint, which we did a year ago, to try and make sure that we would interrupt this growth in staffing. So that's when the senior team and I did start getting involved and did start to have a bit of top-down management, which previously we had not done, because that's not the way the University of Edinburgh has run for 20, 25 years. It's a very delegated organisation with delegated decision-making. We've intervened because we felt we needed to. What we've seen, again through People and Money, is a flattening off of those staff numbers. So we've very successfully interrupted the growth in staff numbers, but what we've not seen is any downturn in staff numbers, because turnover in the sector is very low, as you'll appreciate.
I've allowed you a long time to
People and Money. Let me just address People and Money. So People and Money, for anyone that doesn't know, is a content management system, an IT system, which has elements of human resources, which is the people bit, and finance, which is the money bit. The implementation of the human resources bit went very smoothly. The introduction of the finance bit did not go smoothly and caused a great deal of disruption to the function of the university.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But we are now starting to see some of the advantages of that system, which I've referred to, is that we've now got really good data, and it helps it aids central decision-making, which would have been difficult without that data.
But do you accept any responsibility on the poor rollout of the People and Money?
So again, the story of People and Money has been told and written, and we've had an external investigation by an organisation called PA Consulting. That report's publicly available. There are definitely lessons learned. I intervened at a time when I didn't realise I would need to.
That's fine then. Yeah, because, I mean, just listening to you for the last few minutes, it's like you step in there, you're the white knight to try and save the university. You're the guy coming up with £140 million of savings that's going to see £90 million taking out your staffing budget.
I've never described myself as a white knight. Those are your words.
Well, but you're explaining that there was issues made by people lower down the pecking order, and you stepped in and you've done this, you've stepped in and done that. Can you not see that as someone at the top of the organisation, which is now going through such massive upheaval, you should bear ultimate responsibility?
So I accept the responsibility of the role,
so
and I am taking...
in accepting responsibility of your role, tell us the failures that you have made and the mistakes you have made in your time as university principal.
I think if I had my time again, I would have intervened sooner in the people and money implementation than I actually did. I thought I could leave it to the experts, but I didn't. I realised that I did need to intervene. I'm confident that the action we're taking now is in the best interest of the university, and I'm proud of the leadership that my team and I are providing in delivering what's a very difficult task.
And that's contrary to much of what your lecturers, the trade unions and the Senate are saying.
Well, obviously people have different opinions about
Everyone's got a different opinion from you at the moment.
Sorry?
Everyone's got a different opinion that I've just mentioned there, from the lecturers who've contacted us, the unions who've contacted us, and the University Senate that voted they had no confidence in you and the University of Edinburgh's management.
They're entitled to their opinions. I mean, the court and the governing body and the executive and the senior team are united in doing what we think we need to do for the best interests of the university.
And none of those people want to just change your plans. We'll come back to a number of these issues. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Good morning. We've seen some significant concerns raised by university about the increasingly hostile policies on migration from the UK government. So can I get maybe a brief explanation on how that is affecting your universities, not just in financial terms, but also in student numbers? If I can come to Professor Miller first, please.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. It was related to Westminster policies.
International student numbers, the
yes.
migration policies, and how that's affecting your international student numbers. How much international student numbers are no longer coming to your university, and how much of a financial impact is that having on your?
So I think in the last few years there were two particular issues that caused some concern for all universities, and we were not immune to that. The first was even just a conversation happening around, for example, what might happen with post-study work visas, and that was putting a number of students even thinking about coming to the UK and indeed Scotland from thinking about applying. So that had an adverse effect. But by far the biggest impact was the decision not to include dependents who were able to come, and that was January of 2024. And we saw quite a dramatic drop in the number of students. We also saw quite an interesting change in the makeup of the students who no longer applied to come. And in our university, we saw quite a dramatic drop in the number of young professional women who were coming to do master's programmes in education because they could no longer bring their dependents. It's also true to say that, of course, universities do not control the visas for dependents. They only control and provide CASs for students who are coming.
And do you have a rough figure for how many students you don't have coming now, and what the financial impact that is on your university?
So we saw a drop of around 2,000 students from the peak to where we are at the moment. The impact on that financially was several £1 million, but it's over a number of financial years because we have 3 intakes a year. Okay. So we have a student that might arrive in May, but we will only take the income for May, and then it falls into the next financial year. So it's over a number of financial years.
Okay. Professor Rigby, do you have any figures?
Yeah, so you were asking about the conditions of this to begin with. The international market is very volatile because people are putting their life savings into coming. And so it's essential that we provide a good service, but also that they feel that a country is welcoming towards them. And it's been a huge advantage to us that Scotland has been so welcome to immigrants, and particularly putting out that feeling that we're open for international students. Nevertheless, we saw a real peak after the pandemic when the world opened up again. And since then, our income is dropping at around £6 million a year, and about 3/4 of that is because international students coming to study with us are reducing in numbers. At the same time, our online student numbers are strong.
Sorry, what student?
Online.
Online, sorry.
So we teach in the Caribbean. Unfortunately, we never get to go there. And we teach transnationally across a range of countries, predominantly in Southeast Asia. Those numbers are strong, but the number of people who want to come to study with us is causing our income to go down by about £5 to £6 million a year for the last 2 years.
Okay, and student numbers, do you know those offhand? No? It's okay if you
my
don't
basic
understand
maths isn't enough to do the division.
Okay. And Professor Matheson, I think you said 20 million when you were...
Yeah.
Did you have figures?
Yes, so I've already referred to the money. We're very fortunate at the University of Edinburgh that our international student applications remain very high. And for us, it's more a question of which ones we take. So we're a selecting university out of that.
So you don't have a problem with falling international
We've certainly
students?
seen a reduction in some nationalities, actually particularly from China in the last couple of years. And we've seen a slight uptick in North American students in the last year or so particularly. But overall, our numbers are still up. The question for us is where do we want to draw the line as to who we take and who we don't? And so there is a kind of sense that the University of Edinburgh in the past 15 or 20 years has always been able to grow itself out of financial difficulty by just taking more students.
So if you've not got a problem with international students not coming anymore, how have you got a deficit then?
So I didn't say we haven't got a problem. We're affected by the same things that affect the whole of the sector, but we're in a fortunate position in that demand remains high for us. What we've not achieved in the last 2 years, and I made this point in my answers to Mr. Ross, were that in the last 2 years we've not achieved the budget that we'd set. So we've planned a budget which is a mixture of numbers and cost, and obviously quite variable across different subject areas. And for the last 2 years, we've not achieved that. So what we've set for the current year is that we think we would work hard to achieve what we achieved a year ago. So we've lowered our sights a bit, but we're still aiming to recruit roughly the same number of students. It's just that the competition is now much more stiff. There are many more people seeking to recruit those students, and we don't want to see any kind of lowering of standards, which would mean that we take students that we would not otherwise have taken purely driven by financial reasons.
Okay, and Ms McPherson, have you got an overall...
Yeah, thank you. The overall picture for the sector, just taking last year, 2024 published figures, we saw a 25% drop in postgraduate taught students, which is where the bulk of our international student numbers sit, and that equates to around about 10,000 students. We've estimated that's cost the sector across the board around about £150 million. And that's due to a combination of the factors that the other members of the panel have already described. The other key issue, I think, for us is geopolitical shocks. So, for example, the fall in Nigerian currency. Yeah. And I think it serves to demonstrate that a funding model that's predicated on international student income as a means of cross-subsidy is actually really quite significantly at risk, because there are lots of factors outside of the sector's control and indeed the Scottish Government's control that impact on income and then lead to institutions having to make increasingly difficult decisions about their operating model and running costs.
Mm-hmm. And talking about running costs, is it correct that the national insurance contributions for universities, the change in them is going to cost £50 million or upwards? That's what I've been hearing.
The lower end of the estimate is £45 million. Others have estimated it up as high as £57 million. Given that the sector is not in the public sector, we haven't received any assistance to deal with those rising costs. And in contrast to the rest of the sector in the UK, where at the time of the Employer National Insurance announcement, there was an uplift in English tuition fees that we could kind of mitigate and impact that. We've not had that opportunity, so our costs are rising and our income is declining, and that's created a significant pressure on the sector, amongst a whole range of other costs that are, inflationary pressures, etc., that are also adding to the cost of delivery.
Okay.
Could I give you some numbers for the University of Edinburgh on the national insurance?
Yes.
So in that budget that the new government in Westminster introduced at the end of last year, they did put up tuition fees, as Claire has said, for English students. Because a lot of my students come from England, we do benefit to some extent from that rise in tuition fees. That'll give us in the University of Edinburgh in a full year an additional £3.5 million of income. In the same
so the students would be picking up the cost of the
So that increase of tuition fees from 9,250 to 9,550 will give us about 3.5 million additional income. In the same budget, the rise in national insurance charges, employer national insurance, will cost us 14.5 million. So we were given 3.5 million with one hand and had 14.5 million taken away with the other in the same budget.
Sorry, so the English students are in effect paying for the increase in national insurance contributions.
The point I'm making is that
I may be wrong.
No, the point I'm making is that the small increase in tuition fees for an English student does yield us additional income, but at the same time, the cost of national insurance more than outweighs any benefit we might get from that additional income.
Okay, that's all I've got for just now, Convener, but I may come back later on. That's okay.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Go back to the question around international students, and obviously have a particular interest in what's been happening in Dundee University, and the committee will be having a number of evidence sessions around that. There is, however, obviously the work that's ongoing, so we don't want to cut across that. So around international students, I'd be keen to understand what it is that your institutions did and who led the response to that international that challenge in terms of international student numbers, how you've managed to make sure that you're not in the same sort of situation that Dundee University is. Obviously, there's been a degree of agility from you all, which it'd be good to kind of hear about that, and who led that. Professor Miller, do you want to?
The international recruitment team that we have at UWS were obviously central to identifying where we could diversify our international onshore recruitment, and that is what we have done over a number of the past 3 to 5 years. The other thing that we have done more recently is to try and de-risk the issue of onshore recruitment by diversifying our transnational education. And we're doing some of that work at the moment. Now, that's being led by those particular teams, and a member of my team through the Vice Principal Internationalisation is the one who leads on that.
Right, so it's the Vice Principal is leading it for your...
Yes.
That's great, thanks. Professor Rigby.
Thank you. So the normal running of our international recruitment is conducted very, very effectively by my Pro-Vice-Chancellor for that subject area, which is Naomi Graham, and I'm really proud of the work that she does. The strategic decisions around trying to build resilience, build a balanced portfolio that can cope with a risk in any one geographic region lies with the university leadership team, and I chair that, so I would say that I take leadership of that. What we've done since I joined in January is amplify and focus on 3 areas of distinctive income growth that we are pretty sure, when we run the numbers, will overcompensate for the general reduction in international applications. So one of them, which was started by my predecessor, Andrea Nolan, and I really would say for the record she was a brilliant principal, is to set up what's effectively a foundation college embedded at Merchiston. We bring students who need to do a little bit of preparatory study before they can enter an English degree. That's done by a partner, and then we take those students, if they wish to come to us, as they transfer into permanent undergraduate or postgraduate study. That's a really brilliant thing because we can support those people, wrap round support while they learn. The second thing that we're doing in partnership actually with Queen Margaret University is opening a new campus in Egypt. We have a lot of support from the Egyptian government and the British Council. That will come on stream in September. And then the third thing that we're doing is starting, actually this week, teaching across the summer. So we've added another entry point for international students, so that at times of year when our estate is less well used, we're able to teach in it and hence generate income. The essential underlying problem is not immediate solutions to these finances. It's the shape of the institutions at the end of this change. Because those things that I've described, all of them are, I think, really good educational opportunities for students to learn. They're really brilliant ways for my staff to teach. But at the end of it, we don't look like the same institution we were before. And at the same time, because fewer home students are coming to us, our expertise and our focus and the brilliant teaching my staff can do is directed outward rather than directed inward towards Scotland.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's interesting to hear that you've taken a slightly different approach. So Professor Miller talked about the Vice principal leading that work, but when was the decision taken for you to lead the team that took that forward rather than the Vice Principal International, or is it just a different structure you have?
I think it's just a different structure. There was no point at which I would have said, hey Naomi, I'm going to take this over, but rather all strategic decision making is a function of the most senior leadership team. And because I chair that committee, that decision making orientates through my judgment. So it's not me alone, but it's something where we discuss pros and cons and we come to an outcome. Because it's not just about how many students can we get in, it's quality, as Peter was saying. It's the strain on our staff, it's the strain on our timetable. And it's also the outcomes of those students when they return, because they must have a good experience. We owe them an enormous debt of learning and power that they will take back into their lives after they graduate. So it has to be a whole university decision. It can't be just one element of it.
Sorry, Professor Miller, you want to come back?
If I could just clarify, because so that we're really clear, the Vice Principal Internationalisation takes the lead on it, but the decisions are made by the Vice-Chancellor's Executive, which is the part of the structure that I chair in the same way. But we do have, to be very clear, an individual who is responsible and accountable for the development of the internationalisation of the university that reports into the Vice-Chancellor's Executive.
Yeah, just for clarity, is that, I think I was suggesting a change, a difference that maybe it wasn't there. So would that be the same in your situation, Professor Rigby, that there is when somebody is accountable?
Yes. Yeah. Naomi Graham is accountable, but only in the sense that she's brilliant and she does a fantastic job. So not in any sense held accountable on, I don't know, accountable is an odd word because it has both a positive and a negative connotation.
I think obviously we've got Dundee University former people coming in, so I'm keen to understand how other universities are managing this and who's accountable and who's making decisions at other places, so we can understand what's happening there. But that's been really helpful. But, Professor Matheson.
So in terms of decision making, I'd say it's quite similar. We have a senior executive which I chair, which does make the big decisions, and certainly if there was a big strategic decision, like for example opening a campus somewhere else, it's not something that we have sought to do, but if we were doing that, that's inconceivable. That would be taken by an individual, that would be taken collectively. We have a big team responsible for admissions generally, and as I've already said, quite a lot of that in Edinburgh is delegated to schools and programmes, but then there's a central team that collates it and reports on the numbers, so it's quite similar. I'd like to comment on an aspect which I think is relevant to Dundee, and although I'm not an expert on what's happened at the University of Dundee, but I can tell you about what's happened at the University of Edinburgh. But one of the points I wanted to make is about the fragility of international student recruitment. We've developed this situation, and it's right across the UK, but it's more significant in Scotland than in England for reasons which you're probably familiar with, but I will just briefly touch on, where we have to cross-subsidise some of our activities. So we are inadequately funded for the education of home students, and we're inadequately funded for research. Both of those activities are underfunded, and therefore, in order to deliver them successfully to a high standard, we have to have this phenomenon of cross-subsidy. And the cross-subsidy comes from in the cases of the University of Edinburgh, there's only two ways we can generate cross-subsidy as a charity. You know, we don't make profit, so we have to generate some kind of surplus that we can reinvest. The two areas are the recruitment of international students and also what we call accommodation, catering and events. So the running of commercial activity. So, for example, for Edinburgh, in the summer, any spare capacity we have in our accommodation, we can rent out to people who are attending the festival or the Fringe, and we can reinvest any surplus that we make back into the university. So universities have become dependent on cross-subsidy. That's been a phenomenon for well over a decade. And it's actually worked reasonably well in the sense that we've been able to keep the show on the road. When the source of that cross-subsidy becomes fragile, then the ability to manage the university in that way is weakened. And what's happened in the last couple of years is that the reliance on being able to recruit international students from various countries freely, indeed encouraged by both governments to do so, we have seen when those markets become threatened, and the Nigerian market is a very good example, which I think was, as I understand it, a major factor in Dundee, where you have something like a currency crisis, which is beyond anybody's control, that impacts that market. And so if you've become dependent on that market, you're in a very fragile position. Then the legislation that the Westminster government introduced around dependence that you've heard about, that also damaged some markets, some but not others. For Edinburgh, one of our major markets is China. So we have very large numbers of students from Greater China. This is from the mainland of China, but also from Hong Kong, Taiwan and Macau. And we're obviously very susceptible to geopolitics. If China was to invade Taiwan, for example, and all the ramifications of that in geopolitics completely beyond our control, that would be very serious for universities that have a lot of Chinese students as part of this cross-dependence model. Some international student sources are very visa sensitive and some are not. So the Chinese market is not particularly visa sensitive. Most Chinese students come here, study, and then go somewhere else. Whereas students from India and Nigeria, for example, are more likely to want to stay after their studies. So when the Westminster government recently proposed reducing the post-study visa from 24 months to 18, we were grateful that the visa was maintained and was still going to be available at least for 18 months. But even that change from 24 months to 18 is likely to affect those markets where the visa is a major factor in people's decision-making. So that explains some of the fragility of this dependence model.
That's helpful for the record. In terms of your university, who is it that is leading on making the decisions around how the university responds to those particular geopolitical instances, so whether it's China, Nigeria, who's leading on that? So I get that there's a committee that does it if you're building a new institution, but...
So I would say that first of all, the senior team chaired by me and the executive also chaired by me recognise this fragility. And so one of the things we've wanted to achieve in the last few years is to try and diversify our international student recruitment so they're not all coming. I wouldn't say they're all coming, but we wouldn't have such a predominance of a dependence on one particular geographical region. We actually haven't diversified into Nigeria particularly. We're trying to get more recruitment from India, and we've made some success on that, but it's very visa dependent. So that's a strategic priority which would be led by the senior leadership chaired by me. In terms of the actual delivery of what we want to achieve, then we have a team of people, again, reporting to the actually, we don't have a Vice Principal International at the moment because that post is vacant, but we have a Vice Principal for students, part of whose responsibility is around admissions. And so the numbers would be reported into the senior team by one of the members of the senior team. But beneath that, there's a whole team of people who are actually working on international recruitment, including some people in country. So
ordinarily, you would have a Vice Principal at International. How long has that been vacant?
Well, as part of the restraint on recruitment, we've not filled when the incumbent finished at the end of his term last year. We decided not to replace that post because we thought we should also recruit, limit our own recruitment into the senior team. So the responsibility is currently shared between the vice principal, students, and one of the deputy secretaries who has a particular responsibility for students.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Claire. I wonder if you can maybe give us some insight into how universities are working together on this. It's obviously a challenge that we hear is right across the UK, and so whether you're helping universities understand how that challenge and how they respond to that.
Absolutely. Just before I get into some of the collaborative work, it might just be helpful to set out some of the kind of strategic plans that have been helping guide and shape university activity. So in 2020, the UK government published an international education strategy, and it's picking up on Peter's point about diversification. It was very much encouraging two things: one, diversification, and two, international student growth. So that was the policy of the last UK government. So universities that have made decisions to enter into new markets have done so at the encouragement of a UK-wide strategy to do so. Alongside that, we've obviously seen that migration policy hasn't perhaps been supportive and enabling of those outcomes to be achieved. So there's an issue there with coherence of policy. At a Scottish Government level, there's also been a Scottish Government international education strategy, and that's where we've been able to work collaboratively across the sector with the government to do things like destination marketing, to really promote, as Sue described earlier, that welcoming approach to Scotland, and to help international students see that Scotland is a place that we value the international students coming here, the contribution they make to society and to the campus experience. So we've been working at a sector level with the Scottish Government in that space. And we have at University of Scotland an international committee where members of our institutions can come together and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities in this space and share good practice and insight. So we do spend quite a bit of time, given how absolutely fundamental international student income is to sector sustainability on this.
And in terms of who comes along to that, is it mainly the kind of vice principal level that we've kind of heard from
Yeah, so every institution will kind of choose who it is that they send, but it's normally at that VP level or that lead level within institutions, and we come together on a regular basis, and actually Professor Miller currently chairs that committee on behalf of University of Scotland, so our committees are normally led by a principal, so we've got the overview there.
That's really helpful. I'm going to have to come back to you on that point, just to kind of maybe understand how over the last period that group has come together and shared information across the universities?
I would say extremely well, because across all of the institutions that send their representatives, the combined intelligence around different markets and how that is playing out is very strong. So that sharing of information is extremely helpful. As you've heard already, the way in which that comes together with national initiatives, both at a Scottish level and at a UK level, is important intelligence as well. So as well as the United Kingdom International Education Strategy, we have the Scottish Government International Education Strategy, and a number of the members of the University Scotland International Committee also sit on the International Education Strategy Committee with the Minister. So there is very strong connections and very strong interdependency between both of those committees. So it is a real opportunity for sharing of best practice.
And can I just ask, was Dundee University attending those meetings in the previous period?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know who was attending?
Well, since I started, it was the Vice Principal International that was attending.
Just for
while she was there.
The record, who was
Professor Wendy Alexander.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to get... I know we flogged this a bit now. Universities will always be on the back foot with very rapid changes in the external environment, because if you like, our product, our degrees, take a little while to develop and market. So there'll always be a lag time between external events and our capacity to respond to them. And I just think it's worth putting that out on the table, because we can't invent a degree in 3 or 4 weeks and then take it to market. Even in universities that have become really quick at this, there'll be around a year of lag time while we develop a new degree or a new master's, and then we market it, and then we start to recruit students. So one inherent weakness of any university, be that Dundee or Edinburgh Napier or anywhere else, is that as external events change, the rate at which we respond is always lagged, and it's quite significantly lagged. And in financial terms, it lags across financial statements. I just thought that was worth adding.
No, that's helpful. Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Convener. I was having a look at all your financial statements up to last July, and so I wanted to ask you a few questions. And firstly, on reserves, I mean, Ms Rigby, perhaps start with yourself. Now, your income for the year is something like 171 million, and your reserves are 139 million. So, on the face of it, people would think, well, that's quite a healthy position. 139 million is quite good. So could you just say a little about the reserves, what they're intended for, what they should be, that kind of thing?
Yes, and thanks for asking that question. So our reserves are 139, but an awful lot of that is buildings. So the more useful number is probably cash. We have 66 million in cash. And that gives us both resiliency in terms of realised liquidity, but it also means that we can cope with a year of deficit, or we can invest to grow. The problem for me is that my reserves look like they're worth a lot of money on paper, but actually, if you look at a cross-section of my building in Merchiston, it's cladding, rack, asbestos, and then the inner wall. So I have a huge maintenance deficit that I will need to repair in the next 6 to 8 years, and those reserves are building up towards a point where we can spend them on doing up that building. And in an odd way, I would love to flog it, but its sale value is worth about 1/10 of that, because it has a power substation in the basement. So I know that's probably more detail than you wanted, but reserves can look very healthy, but if you can't sell them, they're not actually worth the paper they're written on. But cash is king in the university.
OK, well, I'll come to the others and they can maybe comment as well, but I take your point. You've mentioned RAC, so now we've been given a figure, I think 750 million for the whole university sector. Can you give us a figure for your university, what RAC repairs might be?
So our RAC, we're very lucky with our RAC because it's never been exposed to water. So although it's a bad name, it's not actually, those buildings aren't in danger of structural collapse. They're simply not prone to modern building regulations. So my worry is more asbestos than RAC, because as soon as I need to enter that cavity, for example, if I put in a new heating system, I'll need to close the whole building to remove the asbestos. Right. And while we do that, we'll also look at all of the other structural elements. I guess at the moment, were we to do it today, we have an estimate of about 105 million. But having put up several university buildings over the course of the last 7 years, I would add at least 50% to that in the current environment, because it's so hard to get parts and it's so hard to get construction companies to actually commit to deliver on time and on budget. Right.
Now, when we're dealing with other organisations, maybe like charities and things, sometimes they say, well, we want to have 3 months income in reserves or 3 months expenditure in reserves, that kind of thing, 6 months perhaps. I mean, does a university like yours have a target as to what your reserves should be?
We don't have a reserves target per se, but we do very, very closely monitor our cash, and that's effectively where, if all of our income stopped tomorrow, how long could we carry on before we went broke? And we keep that up. I mean, that could not happen because we're already committed to teaching students. So it's an accountancy game rather than a likely reality. But we've got 5 months cash, so we would have time to do something about any error that, or not error, but any sudden change in income streams.
Well, we could discuss accountancy games, but I think we'll not go there today. That's fine. Professor Miller, same kind of area. Your reserves, are they adequate? What should they be?
In the same way that Professor Rigby has mentioned, the difference between reserves and cash is a really important one. So our cash at the end of 23-24 was around 80 million. Now it sits at about 66 million. In the same way that we don't have a particular target with regard to the amount of time, we regard 90 days as the kind of point at which we would not wish to go below. And we're somewhere at the moment between about 120 and 160 days, depending on when you take a particular cut of the cash position, which is monitored regularly, reported regularly, not just at an operational level to the Vice-Chancellor's Executive, but to our Audit and Risk Committee and ultimately into the court through the reporting mechanisms that we have. Our reserves are around, or the cash that we want to keep are largely around investing in buildings, as well as other infrastructure. We've got 5 campuses that we look after, 4 in Scotland and one in London. So that takes up a significant amount of capital. The capital grants that we've received from the Scottish Funding Council have diminished over quite a significant period of time. So that maintenance backlog is also an issue that we have to deal with. We didn't have a huge issue with regard to RAC. We had it in one corridor in one building, which meant that a thoroughfare and a number of classes were closed for a period during which time the remedial work was undertaken. I don't have an exact figure to hand as to what that cost, but I can easily supply that.
So your deficit last year to July was 17 million. Presumably that's not sustainable?
Indeed.
And what are your actions? So
the court agreed a multi-year recovery plan, which we are in the middle of at the moment, and which saw a deficit position for this year, a much lower deficit position, aiming to be around 8.4 million, with a further deficit position, again, reducing quite dramatically for next year to about 3 million, with a return to surplus in 26-27.
Okay. And part of that deficit, it says, was actuarial loss and pension plan, 2.6 million. Can you explain to us what that was? I think Napier had something similar, actually.
Yeah, I think that's just a sector-wide issue that we've seen right across all of the pension schemes. For modern universities, one of the issues is that we, for new academic applicants or members of staff, we have to enrol in a particular pension scheme, the Scottish Teachers Pension Scheme, and the system that is there obviously contributed to that, as did the contributions. So the contributions from an employer perspective rose from 23 to 26%. Which actually now means, when you combine that with the national insurance contributions, now means that a pensionable academic staff in that scheme now has an additional on-cost of 40%. So that has contributed to our staff costs.
Okay, thank you. Professor Matheson, your university is obviously, I think, about 8 or 10 times as big as either of the others, so it's a slightly different scale. And your reserves are also a slightly different scale, about £3 billion. Are you in the same position as the other universities as to what that £3 billion is for?
Yeah, so thank you for acknowledging the difference in scale. And it's worth just noting that. I mean, all of the numbers look big for the University of Edinburgh, including the savings target that we've set ourselves, because we're a very large organisation with very substantial income and expenditure. Our reserves are indeed just over £3 billion. In valuation, about £2.4 billion of that is fixed assets, so that's buildings largely, and therefore not easy to mobilise. Although, again, we are looking at our estate, we are looking to see whether we can downsize, can we sell, can we mothball, what can we do to reduce the size of our estate. But certainly in terms of counting an asset, it's a fixed asset, it's not liquid. Of those assets which are liquid, which is the remainder, about 600 million, a substantial proportion, probably more than a third, maybe as much as a half, are restricted. In other words, they're endowments or their gifts or their donations which are for a restricted purpose. They can't just be mobilised to spend on something else. So the actual amount of cash we have is what we focus on. We have a minimum, we agreed with our governing body, we have a minimum level of cash that we wish to maintain. For us, it's 110 days, so it's getting on for 4 months. That's the level that we maintain, and we're currently above that. But again, if we took no action on our current expenditure, we would drop below that minimum days requirement. That has implications then for our covenants with our lenders, and also for our financial prudence in terms of making sure we maintain that resilience that's very dependent on cash. On RAC, we knew where we had RAC. We've got a state of very mixed age. We've got some very old buildings, we've got some more modern buildings. So we have buildings that were built during the sort of RAC era, if you like. So we knew exactly where it was. And when RAC became such a focus of attention, we inspected all of the RAC in all of our buildings. We found some that needed to be replaced, and we've spent already something like £30 million replacing RAC. That's money we've had to find ourselves because there's been no help from any government or from any insurer. And so there's an example of why we need cash resilience, because these things come along and we have to deal with them for the best interests of our members of our community, and we have to find the money to do it. Can I just comment also on surpluses? In your SPICE document, I don't know what SPICE stands for, but the document that you're providing...
Scottish Parliament Information Centre.
The information that you're provided with, which was also provided to us, and incidentally I thought it was a very good document. In there's a figure which I was planning to quote to you if you didn't know it, but now you do know it because it's in the document. But the sector collectively in 22-23, if you add up all the surpluses and deficits across the sector in 22-23, the cumulative number was 211 million. And that excludes Dundee and it excludes the Open University. So it's 17 universities, 211 million. 12 months later, 23-24, it was 17 million. The University of Edinburgh in 23-24 made a surplus of about 23 million. So our surplus more than accounts for the sector-wide total, which tells you that the rest of the sector cumulatively is in deficit. And I think that's why we continually want to make the point that there is a sector aspect to the current finances that is not just confined to the University of Dundee or indeed any other individual university.
Okay, I mean, I think I made the point. I mean, I accept that Edinburgh is different. Just in the figures you mentioned about your surplus, I mean, the accounts for July 24 show a surplus of 392 million for Edinburgh. Now, I think one of the major factors is the pension scheme. can you just tell why your pension scheme is a big positive, 350 million positive last year, compared to the others?
The reason is because our major pension scheme is USS, the University Superannuation Scheme, and the valuation of USS has fluctuated massively in recent years. And so when we publish our surplus, indeed, that's the figure that's in there because it takes account of fluctuations in USS valuation. What we also publish is what we call the underlying surplus. And the underlying surplus is actually the surplus on operations, and that's the 23 million that I quoted.
Yeah, okay. So you just had a one-off good year last year, but that could change.
Well, it's not money. It's not real money. It's valuations of a pension scheme.
I mean, just on the point too, you were talking about restricted and unrestricted reserves. I see the restricted reserves are 99 million. The unrestricted reserves are 2.1 billion. But a lot of that, as you said, is fixed assets. I mean, presumably, as the convener asked you a bit about this already, I mean, if you stop building new buildings, then that would protect your cash and your unrestricted reserves. Have you made any moves in that direction?
We have. So can I just also remind the committee that it costs me £120 million a month to run the University of Edinburgh. So that's roughly what it costs to pay the bills. So that's the salaries and all the other expenses. So £120 million per month. So if I was to do what people have been suggesting I should do, which is dip into the reserves in order to get us through this period of time, you can see from the numbers you've quoted that it would only last us 3 or 4 months. And so actually it would only be a very short-term solution. So it's not attractive as a way of putting the university into a sustainable position. It just kicks the can down the road a little bit. There are other uses of our reserves. So, for example, in the last 2 financial years, most of the surplus, the underlying operating surplus that we've made, has been due to donations and to interest on our treasury. So it actually provides a useful source of surplus when what we really need to be doing in order to make the university sustainable is to generate a surplus on our operations. That's what we're seeking to achieve. In terms of the proportion that's fixed, you're right. It's mostly buildings, and we can't mobilise those overnight, as Sue has said.
Yeah, but still 300 million unrestricted, not in buildings, seems like quite a good figure.
But it costs me £120 million a month, so that's not even 3 months' worth of money.
Yes, okay. And I think the final area I want to touch on again, the convener asked you about the numbers of staff, because again, comparing the 3 universities, and I accept the scale's different, but the number of staff within the other 2 universities stayed roughly steady between 23 and 24, and yours went up by 958, which, given that you seem to be coming into a difficult period, seems quite a big increase, given you've got, what, 12,000 staff roughly. You know, is it these same staff will be leaving, or you know, why were so many staff brought on and now you're having to get rid of some?
So actually we have about 18,000 staff. It's about 13,000 full-time equivalents because we have a lot of part-time staff. So yes, in fact, that year you quoted, there was that rise. In fact, the previous year there was a similar rise. So over the 2 years, between 21 and end of 23, beginning of 24, our staff numbers went up by a total of about 2,000. And that was right across the university. It was in every department. It was in every kind of staffing group. And it's that we felt that we needed to put a stop to a year ago when we introduced our recruitment restraint. So there had been this period of growth. And I think there were many factors around that. Some of it was around for example, the City Region deal, which has been a big success for us. That's led to some staff recruitment. We've introduced new approaches to student support in particular, and that led to some new recruitment. So there were a number of reasons why that recruitment was going on. The realisation that it was unaffordable, as I answered the convener at the beginning, the realisation that continuing that was unaffordable came about 2 years ago when we started to see this threat to our what had been previously regarded as a very safe source of international subsidy, which is of cross-subsidy, which is international students. When we saw that weakening, we recognised that we couldn't allow that to continue. That's when we introduced recruitment restraint, and that's why we feel we need to reduce the staff base now. The voluntary severance scheme that we've already run has certainly been helpful, but voluntary severance schemes, as you'll be well aware, are not targeted at any particular area. It purely depends who comes forward. And so we didn't expect it to solve the problem entirely, although it has made a contribution.
So in retrospect, do you think it was a mistake taking on all these 958 staff?
I think there were good reasons for doing it, and I think people at the time thought it was affordable, but we recognise now that circumstances have changed. And again, I make the point that a lot of these events that have changed are beyond the control of us or any other university, which is things like, inflation, wage inflation, utilities costs, the cost of living pressures, war in Ukraine, affecting building supplies, etc. So a whole load of external events. It's the coming together of all of those events on a period of fragility that's led us to have to change tack.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think I've pretty well used up my time, but Ms McPherson, do you want to say anything else about reserves, university reserves as a whole?
I think Peter's covered the kind of the headline figure for the sector. What we've seen is, given all of the challenges within our operating environment, a significant decline in the kind of financial sustainability of the sector, and that's coming through in the numbers very clearly. And that's why we think it's really important to have a broader conversation about financial sustainability and to bring everyone together to think about different ways of tackling these challenges, because all of the indicators are that our operating environment isn't going to suddenly improve. Costs continue to rise. There continues to be real fragility in the international student recruitment market, and public investment in both research and teaching has continued on a negative trajectory.
And if we were to look at one figure in any university as to, what's the key figure, it would be better looking at the cash balance rather than reserves, do you think?
Absolutely. I think it's looking at, and we're more than happy to provide further information to the committee that sets out from our perspective the kind of key indicators, but the cash position is absolutely critical.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
So, Peter, just in response to Mr Mason's last question, you said people at the time thought this significant increase in the number of employees was affordable. Were you one of those people?
Yeah, I think collectively we thought that we would be able to survive, have enough resilience to survive the external pressures. But
so what were your monthly costs ahead of that? So a few years ago, before you increased it by about 2,000, what were your monthly costs? If they're now 120 million a month, what were they before this significant spike in employees?
They've gone up steadily over the last, as they have for all organisations over the last few years.
You're very keen to tell us that they're now 120 million a month. What were they before this significant increase in staff?
Which time point would you like to know about?
Well, say 4 years ago.
Sorry?
4 years ago.
4 years ago.
Because you said it's roughly in the last 4 years that you've increased.
Yeah, so probably about 95 or 100 million pounds a month.
So did you not think, as principal, if we're taking on all these extra people, it's going to cost us tens of millions of pounds every month, and therefore, is this really affordable?
Precisely, which is why we stopped it a year ago.
No, but you're saying you thought at the time it was affordable.
I'm saying that people, the budget, I'm not a budget holder. The budget holders.
But you said, because my first question was, were you one of these people? And you said yes.
Yes, I mean,
So now you're telling me, as one of the people that thought this was affordable, you also didn't question spending tens of millions of pounds every month on additional staff.
We constantly question the budget holders. The budget holders an annual planning round of setting budgets. Every year, those budgets are revised and changed. There's a process that we have that's led by the Director of Finance and the Provost, which engages with each budget holder, sets their plans for the years to come. So that over the last couple of years, there's been a realisation that the plan was not going to remain affordable.
Should you have realised this earlier as principal?
Well, it's easy with hindsight, isn't it? But I think
I'm asking you.
Well, we realised
Should you have realised this earlier?
We realised it at a time when the facts became obvious, which was 2 years ago.
And you shouldn't have seen it coming because you were now spending tens of millions of pounds extra every month.
We didn't know. We couldn't predict some of the external events that were going to happen in that 2 years.
You mentioned utility costs to Mr Mason. Your own utility costs are paid for. You don't pay them for your own, the house, the principal's house.
That's correct.
You also spoke about buildings being sold off. Now, the University of Dundee have decided to sell the principal's house. Is that something you can or would consider doing in Edinburgh?
It's the house was actually donated by an alumnus to the university for the principal to live in it, so that was a specification of the donation. So it's not quite so straightforward.
But could it? Have you looked into that as a potential saving?
All of the buildings of the University of Edinburgh are under consideration as to whether we need them or not, for sure.
And do you think you need a principal's house?
It's not for me to comment.
Well, you are the principal, so I'm asking, do you need it to do your job?
I told you I was made an offer and I accepted it. That included the house.
Yeah, you told us that before you told us you didn't know how much you got paid. But do you believe you need a principal's house? Because other universities in Scotland, in significant financial difficulties, are selling off the principal's house.
If I thought selling off the principal's house would solve the problems of the University of Edinburgh, then it's certainly something that could be considered, but it would be a tiny contribution to what is a massive challenge.
I accept that. But is this now something you are considering and will look at?
It's not up to me.
Is it something that you can put to the court to consider?
It's not up to me.
You've put forward a proposal to save £140 million, 90 million of which is for staff reductions. Therefore, it is up to you to suggest, as principal, to lead from the front, that you don't need a house paid for you, you don't need utility bills paid for, and I believe you get a car as well?
I don't get a car,
You
but
don't get a car.
there's a university driver.
Okay. So you don't drive yourself?
I walk mostly.
But when you are in a vehicle, you tend to get a driver?
I have my own car as well.
Okay.
No, I have my own car as well.
But these other things, so the driving service, the house and the utility bills, you could put that forward to the court to say this is a saving we can make, to show that you can lead from the front with your organisation.
My employment package is a matter for the Remuneration Committee. They would, if they wanted to make that suggestion, they could make it.
But you could offer that suggestion for them to consider?
In theory, I could offer to be paid zero for them to consider as well.
Could you put that forward as an offer? Would you show willing that you don't need all these perks over your significant salary?
I don't think it would solve
I'm not
the
saying it
problems of the
would,
university.
but it would be a signal that you are keen to look at every... Because you have told this committee you're looking at selling off buildings. Why not the building you live in rent-free?
We're looking at all buildings.
So you will put that forward?
I haven't said that.
So how can you look at all things if you're not going to put that forward?
Because we have an estates department that runs all the buildings of the university, and they're responsible for decisions about all of them.
Do you think they'll be watching this thinking, Sir Peter is quite happy for us to consider this, or Sir Peter would be adverse to losing his free house?
You'd have to ask them.
Well, I'm asking you, would you offer that up? If they were watching just now, would you say, this is something you can consider for the better good of this university?
I think it's one thing that could be considered, yes.
Okay. Ross Greer.
Thanks, Convener. I'd like to stick with the property questions. And Peter, you've mentioned that there's an assessment ongoing of the university's property portfolio. Could you just give us a bit of detail on that, given that there's obviously significant distress amongst your workforce at the moment around the potential of redundancies? It'd be useful to know how the assessment of the property portfolio fits in with wider cost-saving measures. Are you expecting a report to go to the university court at some time soon with an assessment of the portfolio and what assets might be disposed of? If you could just give us a little bit more detail on how that aspect of it's being assessed.
So the University of Edinburgh owns and operates about 500 buildings across the city. It's a very large estate, very mixed in terms of age and condition and suitability for its current use or for any other use. So it's a pretty heterogeneous estate. We have utilisation data on the estate which show us that the estate is underutilised. We know that quite a lot of the buildings are not utilised heavily, particularly on some days of the week. And that's changed since the pandemic because obviously working patterns have changed. So we do have quite a lot of information. What we've asked our estates department, so again, we have an estates department with a director of estates, and the director of estates is a member of the university executive, again reporting into the executive which I chair. We've asked the estates department, led by him, to look at which buildings we've got that somebody else might be interested in buying. There has to be a kind of reality which says, OK, there are some of our buildings that we may not want, but would anybody else want them? And so he's done an analysis of that. He's come to us with some possibilities, including costings of what money would we gain if we were to sell a particular building, and what would be the costs of re-providing for those people in that building somewhere else. So we have quite detailed analysis of that. It hasn't yet got as far as being a specific proposal. What we've asked him to do is to do some scenario analysis. The other thing that we've done is that we've looked at the projects that we currently have, which have already been through so we have a governance procedure that approves capital projects. It starts with the Estates Committee, then it goes to the Policy and Resources Committee, then it goes to the Court. And within those currently approved policies right now, for this year and next year, we have this thing which we call Category C. I won't bore you with the details, but Category C is projects that we've not yet started. So they've been approved, we've got a business plan, and we've got a reason for wanting to do that project, but they've not yet started. And within that category, we've asked how many of those projects could be either delayed or cancelled. And the answer is about £40 million worth. So we've actually paused about £40 million worth of projects that we would otherwise have proceeded with purely because of this current issue of affordability. Now, I come back to the point, this is not addressing the increase of our expenditure. This is not there's a little bit of recurrent expenditure. If we were to sell a particular building, then next year and the year after, we wouldn't have the maintenance costs.
Yeah, I accept that this just reduces the deficit and at best buys you time.
Yeah,
but buying time is not in and of itself a ineffective activity.
Yeah.
But it concerns me a little bit, because it sounds like the exercise your Estates Director is doing is a useful one, but it doesn't sound like there's a particular timescale attached to it. My concern is that you are moving forward with redundancy processes. Staff are facing the prospect of losing their jobs. If I was in your position, I would want a bit of urgency on this estates review, and not just a property, but I'll come to other assets in a minute. I would want a bit of urgency with that, so that I could know, right, what are my options here other than losing staff?
Sure.
So what kind of timescale are you attaching to that exercise, and how does that sit alongside the timescale for staff redundancy processes?
So the suspension of the what I call the Category C projects, that's already been decided. So that's been through the governance procedure up to the court and been agreed. So we have paused a group of projects that would otherwise have been proceeding already, and that buys us a bit of time. It preserves our cash for a bit longer, and it buys us a bit of time. So that's already been decided. That's useful. In terms of disposing of bits of the estate, obviously we have to have a willing buyer. So there are discussions going on with people that might be interested in buying bits of our estate. We haven't at the moment made any decisions to sell any particular building. We don't rent very many buildings. We rent one major building. Most of the buildings we occupy are the buildings that we own, but we're seeking to avoid renting anybody. So we're seeking to move staff out of the building that we rent, just because that's a cost that we could lose. So these things are happening now. They are buying time. They do not solve the underlying issue, which is that our costs, and it's all of our costs, but it's particularly our staff costs, are not affordable and therefore need to be changed, and that's why we're doing the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I acknowledge that, but just to go back to this exercise in the assessment of your estate, has your Estates Director been given a deadline by which he should report to the executive team, and do your court have any indication of when this could be tabled as a paper for their consideration?
Yeah, so he's already reported to, I'm trying to think when it was relatively recently. He reported this initial analysis I referred to about which buildings we've got and what could we yield by selling a particular building. Do we think somebody would be interested in buying it, etc.? That's already been presented, so that hasn't gone to court yet as a proposal, but it's certainly in the thinking of the Estates Committee. The Estates Committee reports at every court meeting. We've got a court meeting coming up. There's a standing item for the Estates Committee report, and they will constantly ask about this question. You know, how are we doing on looking at where we could mobilise some cash? But I'm going to keep saying this: it doesn't solve the underlying problem.
Absolutely, and I acknowledge that, but just looking to make sure that no stone is left unturned
Sure.
here. As well as your property portfolio, the university obviously has other assets that are not property. Are you assessing all of that? And I recognise that the scales here are quite different, but you are one of a number of universities that holds a number of pieces of artwork, for example. Now, there's a perfectly legitimate argument that says it's in the public good for the university to have that art rather than it be sold to a private collector and the public lose access to it. But given the financial situation the university is in, is your assessment of all of your assets going as far as non-property assets? So, for example, the artwork.
Yeah, I mean, artwork would count as a non-liquid asset. I mean, we can get value. We have valuations for artwork. Again, I am going to repeat the fact that we need £120 million a month. We'd have to sell a lot of artwork to even pay 1 month's costs. It's not going to solve the problem.
No, but it can be a piece of the puzzle here. Like there's no single solution to that. Well, the one single solution to solving your problem in one go would be to make a vast number of your staff redundant, but I would suggest there would be significant negative consequences of that as well. So given that, and my suggestion that no stone should be left unturned here, are you making an assessment of all of your assets, not just your property portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of our fixed assets, we know where they are, we know what they're worth, we know what difference it would make if we were able to liquidate them.
Is that an active consideration? Is what
it's actually part of what we do constantly. I mean, we recognise that, particularly our estate. I mean, the estate's a much bigger issue than the artwork. The estate is much more in terms of, first of all, in terms of a maintenance cost. We have about £30–40 million a year mandatory spend on health and safety and routine maintenance on our estate, partly because the estate is so old. So the estate is, and also in terms of climate, in terms of making the university a net zero organisation, which is an ambition for us. The estate is the biggest challenge. So there are lots of reasons for focusing on the estate. I don't think that selling the artwork, it would be a major contribution to what we need to do, but we have asked ourselves which of our non-liquid assets could we liquidate, and if we thought that was the answer, we would do it. But the reality is it's our operating spend that needs attention.
not unrelated to the point that you've just made around maintenance, the capital depreciation figure in your account seems to have gone up significantly in recent years. Now, obviously, that is not something that is going to be even year on year, just with the nature of capital budgets full stop, but particularly of depreciation and what the factors are on that. It does seem to have risen significantly. So I think in 3 years it's gone from 60 million to the projection for, not next year, but the one after, would be 117. So in the region of doubling. Do you have any detail about why the depreciation figure appears to be rising consistently and quite rapidly?
I think it's the nature of our estate, and it's the fact that over a period of decades we probably haven't been able to maintain and repair the estate to the extent that we would wish. So we've got a lot of buildings that are old and unfit for purpose. We would like to either mothball them or sell them, but they've obviously got to be in a condition for somebody else to want to acquire them. So we have a bit of a liability with our estate, and you'll be aware of the accountancy term EBITDA, so the earnings before interest, taxation, depreciation and amortisation, which is a standard accounting measure. That's an attempt to take depreciation out of our consideration so that we can look at the underlying cash position. So you're right that there's been an increase in that number, and 117 is the projected figure for 27-28, not 180 as was quoted by UCU in a recent meeting, despite the fact that they'd seen the 117 figure before that letter was sent. But it is a substantial pressure for us, and it's a substantial issue for me thinking about my successors in the future. They're going to inherit this estate. We have to do what we can to try and make it more manageable, and addressing the depreciation costs would be a big part of that.
Thanks. And just one final question, and taking on board everything that you've already said around your own salary package. You acknowledged to the convener at the start of the session the 5% pay increase, salary increase that you had at the start of the financial year. I accept the point you've already made that that alone, even if you were paid nothing, is not going to cause a multi-million pound, tens of millions of pounds deficit. But do you believe that your 5% salary uplift was worth the damage that causes to staff morale and the lack of confidence that decisions like that, not just that decision, but that decision being emblematic of what staff see as a wider problem of senior management insulating themselves from the challenges that the rest of the institution is facing? Was it worth that 5% increase given the upset and distress it's caused staff who have faced the prospect of losing their job entirely?
I mean, there's been a lot of focus today on my salary, and I understand the reasons for that. I mean, I think so it's a matter of record that in the first 4 years I was in the job, I didn't take any pay rises, although I was offered the standard sector pay rise in those years when a pay rise was offered. I didn't take it. The remuneration committee that sets the pay and decides on the pay rise of myself and other members of what we call grade 10, which is the senior grade across the university, wanted me to accept the standard pay rise that everybody else was accepting, and in the last 3 years I have done so. So the pay rise, the 5% that you quote, was the same as everybody else got. Obviously, for me, it's a larger number because of my
to be clear,
salary.
and I don't like interrupting, but to be clear, I understand entirely the process. I'm familiar with remuneration committee processes. My question to you, though, as somebody who accepted that, is do you think that was worth the distress and the damage to staff morale to see you getting a pay increase on an already incredibly substantial pay package, puts you in, I think, the top 0.5% of earners in Scotland, for staff who face losing their job entirely and who are paid less than a tenth of what you are in most cases? Was it worth that, is what I'm asking.
Worth it to who? Worth it to me, or worth it
to you and to the wider senior management team, but to you as the individual at the top of the institution who has accepted that, do you think it is worth it?
So,
do you think it's a benefit, not just to yourself? We'll take that aside for a moment. Is it worth it to the institution for decisions like that to be made? So
the decision that the Remuneration Committee recommended was that the members of the senior team should take the same pay rise, including me, should take the same pay rise in percentage terms as was being offered to the entire workforce, and we accepted that recommendation.
You did. I'm asking you if you think it was worth the distress and upset that it caused. I presume by accepting it, you believe it did.
Well, I think if you answer the question another way, which is, what difference would it have made to the workforce if...
Sir Peter, you are here to answer questions. Mr Greer has asked you the same question in the same way multiple times. Could you please answer Mr Greer's question rather than suggesting to him what he should ask you?
I wasn't trying to suggest what he should ask me. I was trying to answer the question in a different way. If you asked if it's worth it, and I suppose the question is, what would it be worth had I or others not accepted that pay rise? I don't think it would have made people any more confident of their futures or of their jobs. I accept the discrepancy. I completely understand the reason for your question, but I don't think any decision by me whether or not to accept the standard pay rise would have a material impact on people's feelings about their own job.
I don't think it would have made people feel more secure. I think it would have avoided the loss of even more confidence that many staff feel in the senior management team overall. I acknowledge it wouldn't have solved the problem and it wouldn't have made staff feel any happier. But my point is, by accepting it, that further damaged what very little trust staff had in the senior management team, and that those considerations really need to be taken on board on an ongoing basis in the future, but particularly at a point of, I think, what we would all acknowledge as financial crisis. That should be an active point of consideration for the senior management team in the future. But I accept the answer that you've given.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks, everyone, for your responses. Now, I've got a bit of a question. Now, what we're talking about is funding of universities as we stand at the moment, obviously, but we have to also think a wee bit beyond that and see what we can learn from what's happening just now and how future funding might fall. I don't mean fall, but how it might occur. And on that basis, can I probably ask Claire McPherson, what support and assistance that universities in total are getting from the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government, looking not only at where we are just now, but how we can go ahead in future and hopefully avoid some of these problems?
So we engage very regularly with both the Scottish Funding Council and with Scottish Government officials and ministers. And this committee will be familiar over a number of years through both budget bids and evidence that's been submitted that the sector has been saying for some time that the trajectory of public funding is unsustainable and that we need to have a kind of broader conversation about future funding and how we avoid some of the pitfalls that we've been discussing over the course of this morning. No one wants to make any of these difficult decisions. So we have had over recent months, very good engagement with the Scottish Government, particularly as the issue of financial sustainability has risen, I guess, up public opinion and in the Chamber, various discussions about specific institutions. We are hopeful that we can have ongoing discussions with them about how we might look at the current funding model and determine both the funding gap and potential solutions to fill that. I think the sector is very cognizant of the fact that there is a role for us in this space. So we recognise that if we're thinking about the future and the future economic needs of Scotland and the future needs of students, the sector itself will have to change. And we've heard various contributions this morning about the changes that are underway in different institutions and the different models, operating models that are being developed. So we know we've got a role to play in thinking about how we can be more effective, how we can collaborate more, and how we can perhaps help to reduce some of the costs within the system. But we're also pretty clear that those actions alone will not deal with the significant challenges around the kind of overall quantum of funding that's going into the sector, and are really keen to work with the Scottish Government and the Funding Council and indeed all parties to drive the conversation forward and come up with a more sustainable model. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. And does that suggest, it does suggest to me, but does that mean that University of Scotland is working with the university sector across the country to actually try, along with the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government, to try and look at ways that we can actually find a direction out of the difficulties which we've seen, and then actually bring everyone on board to actually ensure that we don't end up with this, or maybe not don't end up with, because that's just assuming too much, but can avoid the problems which we have seen, particularly with Dundee and maybe to some extent with University of Edinburgh as well? Absolutely. I mean, the current system has seen a real terms decline in funding and a negative trajectory of public funding over more than a decade. And we've heard across the panel this morning that costs are increasing. There's inflationary pressures, whether it's utilities, staff costs, etc. And that gap has been increasing between income and expenditure, and the sources of income that help fill that gap are now much more fragile and much more precarious than they were even 5 years ago. So it is not a sustainable model, and that's the conversation we want to have with government, and we have begun having that conversation with them. But we need a solution to this, because otherwise we'll be back here at another appearance talking about more challenging decisions that are having to be made, and the opportunity cost. We see in the example of Dundee just how significant universities are to regional and local economies, as economic actors, as employers, the relationship with business, with public services. And all of that's too important to put at risk, and the current funding model does do that, because we're carrying a high level of risk across the sector at the moment.
Yeah, and attracting students, people to be students, has got to be the future of universities overall. In terms of what the circumstances about homebred, homegrown students in Scotland, and in terms of the payment for their attending universities and so on, how is that working? I know that we've got the major issue about students coming from overseas having fallen in numbers for the reasons that they have, but our homegrown students, the numbers there, did it look positive for the future? And because obviously, if there are difficulties with universities being able to supply the education opportunities, then the numbers of people wanting to go to universities could fall off as well, actually, you know.
I think one of the questions that we ask ourselves, so the demand from Scottish students for the sector remains very high, but one of the questions we ought to ask ourselves when we're thinking about future funding is, what will the future student look like? So we know demographically, beyond 2030, the number of school leavers are about to decline very significantly. We see an opportunity for a more flexible funding model that can better meet student and economic needs. And by that I mean thinking about part-time learning, the role of mature students, people learning, lifetime learning in a higher education setting. The current model is really more traditionally focused on post-school leavers doing a 4-year undergraduate degree. So as well as the financial sustainability issues, I think there's a future-proofing here that we need to think about, is what does Scotland need from its higher education system? How can we make sure that all those people that need to access high-quality higher education can do so, and perhaps in a different format from the model that's currently being funded at the moment? So there's a broader conversation to be had about that.
And are you having positive conversations with the government and the SFC in terms of supporting how that broader range of student attending might actually come about, and as soon as possible, obviously?
We're in the early days, I think. I would be fair to say, of a conversation about that, but the sector is very keen for that to be taken forward at pace, and for it to be taken forward with a level of urgency given the issues that we've just been discussing this morning.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Miles Briggs. Thank you. Good morning to the panel. Thank you for joining us today. And I must say, I've found this a very frustrating session. As an Edinburgh MSP, I've had people at my surgeries, and I think we need to understand really the human impact of these cuts we're talking about. I've had people in tears at these surgeries because they're having sleepless nights. They're not really sure about what's happening as a major employer in the city. Now, we've covered a lot of questions, so I won't have time to go back on them, but I think the transparency around these decisions is really what we need to see for all universities going forward. I wanted to follow on from Bill Kidd's line of questioning in relation to the impact, for example, on the cap on the number of Scottish domicile students attending Scottish universities, and wonder how many students are we aware of in Scotland attending English universities and paying tuition fees there who would otherwise be at Scottish institutions? Maybe bring you in there.
And I'll give you some. I'll clarify this if I'm wrong, but from memory, there are currently around about 10,000 students from Scotland that are studying in the English sector. Conversely, around about 33 students from in the rest of the UK studying in Scotland. So there is cross-border flows, but yeah, around about 10,000 students studying in the rest of the UK.
Yeah, and is that
33?
So 10,000 Scottish students studying in the rest of the UK and 33,000
Just wanted to be
students,
clear.
Sorry, 33,000 students from the rest of the UK studying.
Yes, yeah. So in terms of the announcements we've had recently, the Finance Secretary announcing a cut of 1,200 publicly funded places in Scotland, we're obviously losing Scots who want to study in Scotland to south of the border, but then gaining UK funding from other places. The model you're outlining, Claire, I just wondered where, given the financial insecurity of the sector now, and we're seeing that across, over the last 18 years, this has been the Scottish Government's funding model. They have said it will not change. Where has been the sector saying this is about to break? And I really think like some of the funding challenges we now face, job losses, have been building for 18 years. And just wondered where we are now sitting around this table, and it seems that the Scottish Government are not wanting to do anything about this, that we will just go down this road, and why we're here, and the Scottish ministers haven't really woken up to this earlier as well.
I think, to pick up on just one specific point before I answer your more general question, I think it's really important to not assume why students make the choices that they do. So the 10,000 Scottish students that are studying in England may not be doing so because there's not a place for them at Scottish University. They may be doing so because there's a particular course or a particular institution in another part of the UK that they want to study in, and that's a perfectly acceptable choice for them to make. I also think that when we're looking at the number of places, we have to be clear about the difference between the number of places in the system and where those places are. So there's a conversation for us and an ongoing conversation I think we need to have with the Funding Council about the distribution of places. So how do those places how can we make sure they're allocated in a way that better meets student demand? That's part of it, so that's a kind of distribution of funding. And then we've been talking a lot this morning about the quantum. And I think the quantum, as you know from say, a number of years, the sector has been saying the trajectory of public funding is unsustainable. We have also struggled at times, I think, to demonstrate that impact. And now we're in a situation where there's a large number of really obvious indicators of that challenge.
Yeah. And has University of Scotland done any work around, for example, medical courses and Scots not being able to access those? I've, again, had families come to see me who cannot get to a Scottish university to study medicine, and so have gone south of the border and then had their career south of the border as well.
We can provide you we have a lead member for health, and we work very closely with the NHS around medical places. It's obviously a very selective course, and so I think that, and Peter may, as a institution with a medical school, may be able to come in on some detail on that.
Can I? Yeah. Can I? Miles, can I first of all just acknowledge the point you made at the start of your intervention, which is around the impact on your constituents? We fully recognise that. As you know, we offered to, the Provost and I offered to come and speak to a group of MSPs. I think some of your officials were there, representing those people. So we recognise the impact on your constituents. And absolutely, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to be as transparent as we can, and we're trying to be as quick as we can to minimise that period of uncertainty. So one of the major justifications for the timescale that we've adopted is to try and reduce that period of uncertainty, because human beings are very good at, and I know this from my medical background, very good at dealing with bad news, but find uncertainty very difficult to deal with. So we very much understand that and want to address it. On the point about where's the sector been, I can speak in two ways on that. I mean, firstly, I am a board member of the Scottish Funding Council. I have been for a number of years, and I can tell you that the Scottish Funding Council has been thinking about aspects of sustainability of the system all the time I've been on the board, and of course that applies to both universities and colleges, because the SFC has responsibility for both. So they've certainly been, in all of their conversations with government, been very conscious of the threat. I personally have been speaking about this all the time I've been in Scotland. About 2 years ago, I wrote an article, almost exactly 2 years ago, May 2023, I wrote an article in one of the newspapers in which I pointed out the anomaly that you refer to, which is that a family that's decided that they can pay for their offspring's secondary education in Scotland cannot pay for their tertiary education in Scotland, but they can pay in England or in Spain or the United States. And that leads to the phenomenon of both talent and money leaving Scotland. And I think that is an anomaly that needs to be discussed. And in that article, I appealed for a calm debate about the future funding of higher education. Frankly, there was no calm debate. There was some rather non-calm interventions by a couple of people directing their attack at me and telling me I'd got none of my business and I should concentrate on my own university. But actually, I do think that we need a debate. Quite frankly, no one's been terribly interested. Politicians, media, the public have not been terribly interested. Every year when the University of Scotland makes its budget submission, it makes the point that universities in Scotland are one of Scotland's major assets. And in our opinion, everything that could be done to ensure their future should be a political priority. It has not been. And probably the only silver lining of what's happened at the University of Dundee is that it's got everybody's attention. And suddenly now there is a debate. And I hope that we can have a cross-party debate in the run-up to the next Holyrood election and after it in terms of what are the alternatives. There was a conference hosted by the Royal Society of Edinburgh just last week, planned actually a couple of years ago, so ended up being very timely, where there were lots of illustrations of I wasn't able to go to the whole conference. I know Pam Duncan-Glancy went to quite a bit of it. And there was a lot of discussion about what other countries do. So there was discussion about England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but there was also discussion about the Republic of Ireland, Australia, a number of other countries. And I think it's fair to say that no one has the perfect model, but I didn't hear a single voice in the amount of the conference I was able to attend. I didn't hear anybody saying that the current system in Scotland is sustainable. So what we need is a sustainably funded system by whatever mechanism.
Yeah. And in relation to the Scottish Funding Council and penalties which universities will face, do we know how much universities have had to pay back in terms of penalties for taking above the number of Scots domiciled students, or is that not available?
The Scottish Funding Council doesn't give us the kind of figures for that at a collective level. Obviously, individual institutions will know what they've been asked to pay back, either because they have over-recruited or because there's been a level of under-recruitment. But that adds to financial challenges within the sector because people have to anticipate what may be taken back from this SFC when they're reconciling that.
Do you have a figure on that in the sense of money allocated by the Scottish Government which is then being taken back?
We've not gathered that at a sector level.
It would be useful maybe if there's that data. And I wanted to move on then to clawback, because I know this is also a concern in terms of courses not delivered. And again, you know, Scottish Government allocating this funding and then asking for it back from the sector. So I wanted to ask in terms of how that could be reformed and what impact that's having. I don't know if I can maybe go through the universities principles to find out what that currently stands at in terms of this year's clawback. Maybe start with yourself, Professor Miller.
Yep, thank you for that question. So one of the issues with clawback is that it's always retrospective. So for the current year, we were actually talking about clawback for the year 22-23. And for my institution, that was just over £8 million. Now, the mechanism that exists at the moment is for universities to provide some what are known as mitigations, so an understanding of why we have under-recruited in the way that we have. And I know a number of universities, including my own, did that. Now, despite that, we were given we were not allowed to keep any of that clawback. So I don't have a figure for all of the institutions, but for my institution, that was £8 million. So for 23-24, we've yet to understand the impact of a clawback for the coming year. And we're only a small number of weeks away from the new academic year, but no doubt we will be told in due course. If the same was to be applied for my institution, it would be a further £10 million. So very significant in terms of our particular situation. Yep. Now, for us, the reason for the under-recruiting, and I should say that for UWS in the last 7 years, 3 of those we were massively over-recruiting and got no additional funding for it. 1, we were within the tolerance limits, and for the other 3, we were below. That almost entirely, but not exclusively, was due to a massive reduction in the number of articulating students from colleges into university. And I'm sure the committee has heard previously around the reduction in college students. Now, that affected a number of universities. It affected us particularly because we are Scotland's largest articulating university. So if I can give you a sense of the scale, in that single year, we lost an intake of 800 students. Now, that's not a single-year impact because in the subsequent years, those are our continuing students. So that is where we have seen. So we've identified what the cause was. We've identified the costs that related to the university. And indeed, across the sector, we have suggested a number of ways in which some flexibility could be applied to the clawback, which would allow both organisations, the individual institution and the Funding Council and Government, to come to an agreed transition as to how that money would be used. Now, what we didn't see was any consistency. So that was not the same approach that was applied elsewhere, either in terms of controlled numbers or indeed with colleges. So we identified the problem, we identified the size of the problem, we identified the cause of the problem, and we've identified more than one solution to the problem, but the money was nonetheless withheld from the universities. And our point was we're not actually looking for any further funding. We were looking for some flexibility in using the funding that was already committed to a number of universities, which might have been able to be managed over a period of years.
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor Bigby. Can you outline?
Thank you. So our clawback, the retrospective clawback, was about 3 million. Half of that came from drops in the articulation from colleges, as James said, the other half from nursing. And I think that might be quite a good illustration of where there is real opportunity to improve the system. So it's absolutely unfair that we should be paid for work we don't do. Sure. So to that extent, a clawback is utterly fine. But the problem is that it takes us a little while to adapt to an emerging market. So as you'll all know, it's really difficult to recruit 18-year-olds into nurse training at the moment. They don't see it as a desirable profession. But unlike a degree like history or fine art, we know that Scotland needs nurses. It's screaming out for them. We know that there's a market in part-time. Lots of people get to a point where they're settled, they have young children, and they would like to commit to a career in nursing. Particularly, we see this among people who are married into the armed forces, because every armed forces base has a hospital. So we have a huge opportunity to recruit part-time, hyper-local students. We have articulation agreements that mean we could teach them in Galashiels, we could teach them in Livingston, we could teach them in Edinburgh. So there's no problem with moving, with childcare, with anything else. In order to develop those pathways, we would need the staff that we currently have. And that's what we're talking about. Clawback isn't money, it's staff. We could take those staff, develop those new routes, and deliver to the NHS the nurse trainees or nurses that are needed. But the barriers to that are at the moment meaning that we simply pay back the money and we do nothing. So we are failing Scotland. The SFC, in a sense, by clawing back is hurting us, but we have a ready-to-go solution. And we think everybody is aware of that. And all it needs is the coordination of agreement between different parts of the government. And that's not to criticise any individual part of it. But some of the solutions we're looking for aren't more money, they're a better way of spending it. Yeah. And a recognition that as our demographic changes and as the needs of the nation change, we need a period of time to pivot from one kind of delivery to another. And for that pivoting point, there's a net cost to the university that can be absorbed through not clawing back money that was expected to be delivered.
Thank you. And Professor Matheson, do you have a figure in terms of clawback?
Well, as I said earlier on, the University of Edinburgh is very fortunate in that we have lots of applicants, and so actually clawback's not a huge issue for us. We try very hard not to over-recruit for the reasons that you've heard, but largely due to a lot of work by a lot of very diligent people, we try to land on target. So we do have small amounts of clawback here and there, but it's not a huge issue for us. I'm conscious I didn't answer your question on medicine. Can I return to that? Yes. Medicine's my own profession, as you know, and also I was until quite recently the lead member for health for University of Scotland, and I'd done that role had that role for a number of years. So the number of places for Scottish domicile students in medicine has increased across Scotland in recent years, and there's lots of competition for students from the rest of the UK to get into Scottish medical schools. There was a point in time when, whilst I was lead member for health, and I think it was probably about 2 years ago, when the allegation was made that the number of applicants to medicine in Scotland was the same as the number of places available. In other words, it was 1 to 1. So there should be none of your constituents whose children can't get into medical school, if that's true. I was very surprised by that, because it's not true at the University of Edinburgh. We still have competition for places. What the 5 medical schools have done since then is to agree, and I actually don't know whether this has now been formally agreed, but certainly in the latter part of my time as lead member for health, the 5 medical schools were agreeing a process whereby if someone applies to a particular medical school and can't get into that particular medical school, they could automatically be offered a place at one of the other 5 medical schools. So they may get a place to study medicine somewhere in Scotland. It may not be their first choice, but I thought that was quite an imaginative way of dealing with that problem.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Clawback, can I take in Pam Duncan-Glancy?
I'll get to some substantive questions in a moment, but it was just on the clawback, and if it's okay, Professor Miller and Professor Rigby, you both spoke of a concern around particular articulation, but then the flexibility in the system. Has the SFC indicated to either of you, or indeed the government, that there's an understanding about the pressures on all of the tertiary system and the flexibility that's required in all of it to deliver what Scotland needs in the future to address some of the problems that you've highlighted?
I think the Funding Council, if they were here, would say that they recognise what that is. I think what we have seen, however, is that that has not translated into changes in the allocation of the funding that's been made available, and that is, I think, illustrated by the mitigation process. So if I go back to, I think, something that was heard by this committee some time ago, that the Funding Council had not received any requests for additional help from other universities. The request came in the form of the mitigation process, looking for some flexibility over that period of time, in recognition of the fact that there are fixed costs that take time to be removed. And there is also an inconsistency in the way the principle of clawback was applied, either between controlled and non-controlled subjects, which is Sue's point around the issue of nursing, which is a controlled subject, or indeed between different sectors, because the way in which it was dealt with in the college sector was different from the university sector, even when you acknowledge that they have different funding systems. So I think the issue is well known and well understood.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anything to add, President?
That was a pretty good answer, I think. I think to make it maybe a bit more human, I think everybody that I've talked to, I know that everyone I've talked to in the Scottish Funding Council is aware that there is an issue across the tertiary sector, and that the solution, whatever it is, needs to be across the sector. The interdependencies are too great, but also the opportunities are so pregnant. You know, we can teach in colleges that sorts out the fact that Scotland is a really rural space and people can't travel if they don't have a car. Colleges can use our articulations to attract more students because they know they've got a degree waiting for them if they perform well. The opportunities are enormous. What I would say, and I've only been here for 6 months, is that I get a sense of bureaucratic lack of agency, that there is a sense that this is what is done, it's what must be done, and nobody is empowered to change it. So when we identify the clawback for nursing, we are told, and it's right, by the Scottish Funding Council, that it's not their decision. The decision rests with health, not with education. But from my point of view, I really, really want to train nurses for Scotland, and that's an insufficient answer to the need that we have. So there are no good and bad agents here, but there is a lack of agency around the piece that I think could be remediated without any more money being pumped into the system.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you.
Everyone, I understand Professor Rigby and Professor Miller the work that both of you do with nursing in particular, because I've got a daughter who actually went through in the west of Scotland and she was waiting for her place for UWS but decided to have 2 more children instead, so she may be back at a later date. But normally, Professor Miller, I'm here talking about the virtues of UWS and all the great work that you do in the area and how important an institution it is to Paisley in particular, but to the other campuses that you have as well. And but I still have to ask the question, because like Miles, I've had constituents coming into me and people who are employed by you saying you're looking at 75 full-time equivalent reductions, I think it's a cut of 6.2 million. And you've not ruled out compulsory redundancies, and you've got this 45-day consultation you're going through. So my question initially would be, you know, there's almost been a perfect storm since you've come in the door at UWS. So how have you got to this position? You know, what have been the main things that have contributed to it? And how do we go on from here? Because there's a lot of people, the unions and those that work for you, there's a lot of concern about what's going on.
And we fully appreciate the concern that is affecting everybody in the university staff as well as students. Hopefully I can make it clear that the perfect storm was not a cause and effect with me arriving in UWS, because what you've heard from the committee earlier is that decade of underfunding across the whole of the sector. But to go to UWS specifically, in July of 2023, we suffered a major catastrophic cyber attack, an illegal cyber attack. And again, I won't go into the details of that, but in our 23-24 accounts, you will see that that cost the university something in the region of £5 million, which we had to find from the reserves. We had no help from anywhere else. What we also saw was that dramatic drop in the number of students, domestic students, coming to UWS. And I mentioned earlier on, in particular, the articulation route from colleges. And that saw that dramatic reduction. And that was part of the mitigations that we put forward to the Funding Council as part of the budget settlement. We got no return from that. If the return had been the same, for example, as the controlled subjects, we might have seen 50% being returned to the university and 50% being retained by the Funding Council. If we had seen the same approach applied to universities as colleges, we would have seen a different number. Now, all of those things would have given us some time and some flexibility to address some of those underlying issues over a longer period of time. But we've just not been able to do that. So what we have done is looked at a whole number of measures, including some of those that you've heard already around really managing vacancies much more stringently than we might have done previously. We haven't gone forward with an open voluntary severance scheme within the university for the reasons that Professor Matheson mentioned earlier, which was around we needed to target where we had seen the greatest reductions in the number of students. And that's precisely what we have done. And that's why we've arrived at the number of posts that we've arrived at the moment. We haven't ruled out compulsory redundancies, but we have made it absolutely clear that that will be the last resort. And we would hope in everything that we do that we are able to avoid getting to that point. I don't think there is any institution, and certainly in conversations with our trade unions, they've not been able to identify any institution who has not ruled out compulsory redundancies. So we need to now enter into this statutory period of consultation, during which we will be in discussions with our trade unions to identify the people, the posts that that fall within this category, whether that will be voluntary or compulsory, and as I intimated to them on Monday of this week. If we get to a point where we can achieve all of what we need to achieve by avoiding compulsory redundancies, we can then have another conversation, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, because that's the part that I think it's an important part for the record that we know that it's it will be the very last option, because I think there's some that, well, you know, when these things happen, Professor Miller, that you end up with all kinds of conspiracy theories. Indeed. And people believe that there is going to be a lot more than what it is. But I was interested in both what you and Professor Rigby said about the funding shortfall with regards to the flexibility that you're looking at, because both of you recruit from the colleges, and there was obviously, for various reasons, a drop, COVID, everything else, in the numbers. Professor Rigby, you talked about a better way of spending the money that's already there. I like the sound of that. And Professor Miller, you talked about more flexible examples. Is there something else, Professor Miller, you could possibly give us more detail on? What other examples? Because I like this. I'm a great believer in, if there's money in the system, we can use it to the best of its, the best way possible to deliver what we're trying to deliver.
Well, if we look at just the size of the amount of money that we are talking about here, and I can only talk about UWS because we don't know what the sector figure is. But if we were given the opportunity, for example, that I've given around 50% of the money being retained, then we can look at how we might be able to do some of these things over a longer period of time, and to recover back to the levels of student recruitment that we might have had some time ago. But we've also just not relied on all former models of delivery that we have used previously. So, for example, you will know, because you're a great advocate of our Foundation Academy, which is about bridging from schools into university, not specifically to UWS, but university more generally. You know about the undergraduate school that we've developed with New College Lanarkshire, which is using a different model, where we're actually delivering the programmes in the college, articulating from their programme straight into it, so they're not even moving the buildings. So, and similarly, if you look at what we did in Dumfries, we actually co-located into the college so that we could get that closer integration. So universities, and I know across Scotland, you will find examples like that in almost every university of new and innovative ways. But we're having to find that within the current constrained financial envelope, as opposed to thinking about how might we invest in new ways of delivery. From our perspective, we've had long conversations with our court about the situation that we found ourselves in, and one of their very clear red lines, if you like, to the executive was we should not reduce the number of campuses that UWS has. Now, that could have been a fairly obvious place for us to go. But if you look at where we have our 4 campuses in Scotland, for example, removing from any one of those could potentially leave a higher education desert in some places, and we were not prepared to do that. What they did say, however, was you need to ensure that we are maximising the effectiveness and the efficiency of the campuses that we do have. And we're doing that in a number of ways, some of which are very similar to the ones that you've heard from Professor Matheson, including disposing of buildings that we no longer require, rationalisation of buildings, and indeed commercial renting out to organisations that are aligned with what we are attempting to do within the university.
Okay. Professor Rigby, do you have anything to say on the better ways of spending the money currently?
Right, I'm conscious of time. Yes. I mean, what's really odd to me coming into this system after a period working in England, and my long-term career has always been in Scotland, but I had a kind of vacation, is that here, if I want to invest to grow, it has to be an international activity. I can't invest in Scotland to grow numbers. I can't increase the number of students I teach in Scotland by actively developing a proposition that people would want to study with. So if I want to set up training in Egypt, I can put in an investment and I can estimate a return. I might be right or wrong, but it's a business transaction. If I want to, as we do, develop a university centre in Livingston, with really great support from Jackie Galbraith and the college, and a really shared vision for that local delivery that can allow Livingston and that area of the Lothians to encompass the economic churn that's going on there, I can't do it because I've no money. I could put our reserves in, but I can't do that because I can't generate a business case, because there's no way that I can get more money by teaching more in Scotland. And that to me is inexplicable, because it's perfectly rational to say these are the number of people across Scotland that we can afford to go into tertiary education. But to fix that some years ago and then just keep it as a constant means that you're asking people like me to be unentrepreneurial with developing the training that Scotland needs. And that seems like a huge waste of effort, or a waste of potential that universities could deliver. And I think there is a lot to be said for saying, let's look forward to what kind of training and skills Scotland might need, not in a terribly granular way, but we know where the economic shifts are going. We know what's preventing people, particularly mature students, from taking up reskilling and upskilling.
Are you talking, Professor Rugby, sorry to interrupt, but are you talking about part of the flexibility that James spoke about is possibly maybe saying, yeah, this is what's happened in the past, but we predict it, or we think we can do X, Y and Z in the future, and maybe kind of been having that conversation with the SFC then?
Yeah, not in the sense of trying to be competitive with other universities and removing places from them, but if we identify the opportunity and the need for skills development in an area, at the moment, that's not a solution that is wanted from us. And I think it's crazy that it isn't, to be honest.
Okay. And finally, I just want to ask a question of Sir Peter. I'm not going to ask you about your salary, because that's been done to death today. I was, but we've talked about that quite a bit. But it was more, I've been on this committee. People are fed up hearing me saying I've been on this committee on and off since I first entered the Parliament in 2011. And during the independence referendum, I kept getting told that universities like Edinburgh may lose, if we got independence, a whole stack of investment from research, because you're one of these universities in the world that excels in research. And one of the questions I was wanting to ask is, we're in a position here where the UK government has cut one of your programmes, was the £800 million supercomputer programme. Now, what kind of effect did that have in your university? Because that kind of programme, I would assume, would have generated quite a bit of kind of work for those within your establishment.
Thank you very much. It's great to get the opportunity to talk about research, because it's something that hasn't come up very much so far. One of the great contributions that universities like Edinburgh make to Scotland, but also to the wider world, is around our research. And it is one of the reasons why we need cross-subsidy, because in order to do our research, we don't get the full costs from the funders. So that's a sort of an intrinsic problem, if you like, for any university that wants to provide research. Research also generates jobs. You know, we generate new companies, we attract inward investments. There's all sorts of reasons for thinking that research is an important part of the ecosystem. On the specifics of the supercomputer, I'm in constant discussion with the Westminster government, various parts of it, about that particular piece of infrastructure. I would make the point that that's a piece of UK infrastructure. It's not specifically for the University of Edinburgh. It just so happens that the University of Edinburgh has the expertise and the facilities to host it. And we host the current supercomputer. We've had the UK's national supercomputer for 25 years. What's needed now is an upgrade to the next generation of supercomputing, and the UK is falling behind because it doesn't currently have one, and other countries do. So if we want to maintain our preeminence in computer science in general, but including AI, we need to have supercomputing capability. I'm still optimistic that the Westminster government has heard that and is willing to understand that that's an important part of the infrastructure they need. Obviously, there's a spending review coming up very soon, and I'm an optimist by nature, so I'm hopeful to get some good news. But I've been around this track a couple of times already. The previous government, I had a written promise from the previous government of the provision of an exascale supercomputer in Edinburgh. But when the general election happened and the new government came in, they said there was no money allocated to that promise, so therefore they couldn't honour it. So I've been around this track before, so I'm not going to believe anything until I actually see it. But I'm pretty confident that the government does recognise the importance of this particular bit of infrastructure, best hosted in Edinburgh, but not just for Edinburgh.
I get that.
I'm more concerned in terms of research funding about the adequate funding of research. There's a systemic problem that any university that wants to undertake research, and it's important for our reputation as well as for our contribution to economic growth, etc., is having to do so in a situation where they're not adequately funded to do it. And so therefore, here's another reason why we're so dependent on international students, is to cross-subsidise our research.
well, I'm not getting into the politics of it because it was used as a big stick to hit me with in 2014, but we still seem to be in a difficult situation for UK government.
And it's true across the UK. I mean, this is not a Scotland-specific problem in terms of the underfunding of research. The underfunding of home education, home students, is more prevalent, more important in Scotland than it is in England, but not the underfunding of research.
Just in the part of the supercomputer itself, so currently, just so I get my head around it as well, because I'm not an Edinburgh MSP, so it's so basically you have the supercomputer now, the infrastructure and everything else, but obviously with the advances in technology and AI now being, we all use it now in various forms, being part of it, you need to go to the next generation. That's what you explained there then. Well, that seems to me, you've not heard this today much, Sir Peter, but I'm quite happy to back you in your endeavours and support you in any way I can to ensure that it goes to Edinburgh.
Thank you very much. And there's been a lot of support from politicians and from industry and from other universities. As I say, this is really a piece of infrastructure that the UK needs rather than the University of Edinburgh needs. It's just that we're actually best placed to deliver it. You asked about the impact of it not being funded. One impact that we've made clear to the Westminster government is if they decide not to fund it, I'd like them to tell me that rather than just constantly delay, which is what's happened for the last 9 or 10 months. But if they make that decision, we will lose staff that are suitably qualified to work on a supercomputer because they won't stay with a redundant supercomputer. So there will be another area of loss for Scotland if that happens.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Miller, just because Mr Adam has started speaking about some of the local area around University of the West of Scotland, I think it was this week or at the end of last week, the Complete Universities Guide annual league table was published, where the University of the West of Scotland, Paisley, was the lowest ranked of all the Scottish universities on that list. How do you respond to that, and what do you do to try and improve your position for next year?
So I think the metrics that are used in some of the league tables don't suit modern universities generally, and I've always had an aversion to chasing league tables. And what I discovered when I arrived at UWS was there were certain things that we needed to get right, and I described that as getting some of the basics right. So one of the issues, for example, was that we had seen a fall in our retention rates, particularly students who were moving from level 7 into level 8. So we put a piece of work in place for that particular time, and we have now seen that number beginning to improve, and ultimately that will feed its way into things like the league tables. So I want to make sure that within the university we get these things right, and the league tables will follow.
Mm-hmm. But you had an overall score of 42% and a UK ranking of 128. And as I say, 15, because I think 2 of the universities in Scotland aren't part of this. I mean, do you just want us to accept that because of the metrics used, you will always perform poorly in this? Or is there, while not chasing some of these metrics, it is something, I mean, this is a well-respected guide. You may not agree with everything that they do, but students looking for their places in the future will have a look at this and will be concerned that the University of the West of Scotland is so low down the rankings, not just for Scotland, but across the UK.
We don't see much in the way of evidence of students making decisions based on those particular rankings. They may for other universities, but they don't for us. Geography and locality has a huge influence on the students that come to us, including the articulation that I mentioned earlier. But if we were to take a different league table, for example, we're the leading university in Scotland for social mobility because of the work that we are doing in ensuring that we are removing the barriers for individuals to come to university through whichever mechanism.
Okay, thank you. Joe Fitzpatrick.
My questions were covered, thanks.
Thank you very much. Willie Rennie.
As a graduate of Paisley, I'm very proud of what the institution does. I think it has transformed since I left some years ago, but it does a tremendous job about giving opportunities to people from across Paisley, but also the west of Scotland. So I think you're right about the metrics. These are not all necessarily the way to measure success, and we should look at added value in addition to those more crude attempts. So I just want to put that on the record. I'm particularly interested in Professor Rigby. your experience from down south and what lessons you learned from that in terms of reforming our funding model, because we've heard repeatedly this morning about issues with it. I mean, if we carry on as we are with no changes, how will the sector look in 10, 15, 20 years' time in Scotland?
Thank you. That's two really difficult questions. So, coming back to Scotland after a period of working in the English system, I think the essential difference is that in England, the recognition is that universities are autonomous and they succeed or fail based on their own efforts. And that has an enormous downside because a university that begins to struggle will struggle more and more. A university that's unlucky and has RAC all over its campus will be in a competitive disadvantage relative to one that doesn't. And there are all sorts of ways in which seeing universities as autonomous businesses is a poor model. The other piece of the problem in England is that the oldest person paying these full student fees back is only in their early 30s. We've no idea what the effect on the economy will be yet of really very, very significant depression of wages of graduates over 40 years of their careers. And I suspect that that will be very severe. Coming back to Scotland, I don't think anyone can decide whether we are truly agents of our own success or failure, and we just need to be left alone to do it, which would mean releasing, for example, caps on recruitment, or whether we are servants of the population and therefore should be in receipt of support to serve that population. Either model can work and a hybrid could work, but I think we need to step back and think, what is the ideal model for the provision of education to this nation? And then we move from there to how you deliver it. I think any quick kind of, can I have more money please, is a fake request if it isn't grounded in that. So, you know, in a sense, if a university falls over here and is put back up, everyone has to support that action. But you can't help in the back of your mind but think a stitch in time saves 9. And we could be looking at maintaining the health of universities that we already have that are relatively healthy in order to help them move on. In terms of what the Scottish sector will look like in 10 or 15 years, it depends on the answer to that question. But if the status quo remains, there will be fewer entities. There can't but be fewer entities because the government can't bail out every one that fails. And most of the ones that succeed will be primarily teaching internationally. They'll be teaching in other countries, or they'll be teaching international students. And they will be renting space in Scotland in order to teach the students who actually bring in the money to keep their staff employed.
Okay. Professor Matheson, you said earlier on you're optimistic. I heard you at the RSE conference last week speaking very well about the clarity that is required. What's your view about what will happen in the next 15 to 20 years if we don't take the action now?
So I would foresee that most of Scotland's universities will survive. I wouldn't be able to say all of them, because universities are extraordinarily good at adapting to circumstances. This is one of the reasons why universities have been around for centuries. I mean, the University of Bologna is 1,000 years old. Oxford is 900 years old. In Scotland, St Andrews is well over 600, and the University of Edinburgh is a mere child at 442. So the reason that universities are able to survive over long periods of time, I think, has two underpinning facts. One is that we are societally important, so societies have decided that we are places that the societies want to support, and politicians of all types all over the world have decided this is a part of their system that they want to maintain. I think that's particularly true in Scotland. As I've said before, I think Scotland should be very proud of its universities, and I think Scotland is very proud of its universities. And having worked in Asia for a while, I can tell you that other people far away from here have great respect for Scottish universities. So I think that's the priority. I think universities will adapt. I think they'll change. They may The only flexibility, as we've talked about constantly this morning, is for us at the moment is on international students. We have no flexibility on home students, on Scottish domicile students. We have limited flexibility on rest of UK students because of the student loan system. And the only flexibility we have is on international students. So that's where everybody looks to see if they can solve their problem. We've done that quite effectively. If that market becomes less reliable, which we're seeing signs of, then that ability to depend on that will be reduced. Universities will find other ways. They'll change. They'll stop providing all of the things they currently provide. Perish the thought they might even reduce the amount of research that they do, because this is another source of financial need. I think that would be a disaster for Scotland. I think one of the great strengths of Scottish universities is our ability to do research, world-leading research, lots and lots of examples, creating knowledge, but also creating jobs and wealth. So what will happen is that the effectiveness of the sector will reduce, but institutions will largely adapt and survive. But whether Scotland gets the best out of its universities under those circumstances, I think is a question for political leaders to make some choices. And this is a question of political priorities. I think, that the universities and the colleges in Scotland should be a major political priority. The evidence in the last 7.5 years that I've been here is that that's not been the case.
I happen to agree with you. I have been banging this drum for some time to try and get the attention, despite our heritage on this issue. I think it is important. Claire McPherson, what do you think in terms of, are you optimistic from your early discussions with various political players about whether we can get that new funding model? What's your view of where we are with those discussions?
I am optimistic, but I also think it's an imperative that we do so. I think the kind of descriptions from the panel of what happens if we don't are really significant. And the sector, this is an enabling sector. So if you care about the future of the climate change, or if you care about the NHS, if you care about public services, if you want to transform the economy, none of that is possible without the higher education sector in Scotland, because we are so crucial in terms of delivery partners from a workforce perspective, from a research perspective, and from a kind of economic growth perspective in terms of placemaking. So it's not a question of if this is going to happen, it has to happen. And I am optimistic that there is a growing recognition that there's a problem to be solved, which sounds like a minor thing, but I think if we were having this conversation even 12 months ago, there wouldn't have been a recognition within this Parliament, or indeed within government, that there's a problem to be solved. And I think we are now there. That's a huge step forward. Yeah, the question for us now is what happens next, and we are, as you've heard from the panel this morning, absolutely keen to frame that discussion not in what's the model we'll replace this current model with, but what is the future needs that Scotland has? What do we want to hold on to? What do we assume is going to exist in the future, and what do we think needs to change? And we want to be part of that conversation.
I mean, I was intrigued by the way that you framed it to me, was that the model of, or the cohort of student that we're going to get in future years is going to be quite dramatically different. Professor Rugby, you talked about, more part-time, older students. The same with Professor Miller. It's all changing. So the current model doesn't really fit that new kind of set makeup of the student body. So do you want to explain a little bit more about
So I think there are a number of drivers for change. We've talked a lot about financial sustainability this morning. So obviously, in order to sustain the sector, we need to see the quantum of investment in each Scottish student go up. But even if that level was sufficient, we would be still having a conversation about change, given the demographic shifts that are happening. So we know that the school leaver numbers are going to fall quite significantly from 2030 onwards. So the profile of a higher education student, a person who wants to access university education, is going to change, and our funding model isn't particularly flexible and adapt. And Professor Rigby has given a great example around nursing. We need something to change, even if the quantum is right. We need to think about models of delivery and how we incentivise and support the sector to be responsive, and both to kind of national needs. So there's some national, we've talked a lot about medicine and some of the kind of controlled subjects, but also locally responsive to employers' needs and responsive to what we think students want from their educational journey. And mature learners and part-time learners are absolutely part of the future, but they're not adequately supported under the current system, and that's a big problem for Scotland.
I mean, I was concerned about the change with the REF between the last one and the latest one, where there had been a reduction in Scottish share of UK Research Council funding from what was about 15 to about 12.5%. Professor Mathen, why do you think that's happened?
Well, obviously, the REF's a very specific sort of snapshot in time, and I actually support the REF. I think it's actually been good for the sector, and I think we could do more to make it more effective at telling our story. I don't think the sector is particularly good at explaining why research is important. People often think that research is kind of not going to benefit them, or it's only going to benefit somebody 20, 25 years down the track. So I think there's work that we can do on the way we use the REF. That change that you referred to, I think, reflects greater competition from other providers. It's a competitive exercise, so people are comparing themselves with others. There's been a substantial investment in research in other parts of the world, so one of the major comparators is international competitiveness. If you look at what China's doing, for example, they're investing billions in their universities trying to improve their international reputation and their impact, and we have to compete against that. So I think the competition's got stronger. What I would really worry about, and I don't think it was probably responsible for that change in that period, but it might be responsible in the future, depending on what happens here, is that people start saying they can't afford to do research. And they have to then prioritise on the things that they can afford to do. That would be very bad news for the UK, very bad news for Scotland, and in my opinion, very bad news for the world, because the UK makes a major contribution to research outputs across the world. We're still highly competitive, even despite Brexit, which took us out of some of the EU funding schemes for 6 years. Despite that, we remain very much in demand as partners. European universities are constantly beating down the door certainly to the University of Edinburgh, and I'm sure to other universities as well, saying they want to work with us. So we're seen in the sector as being highly impactful, but it's fragile because of this cross-funding issue.
Professor Miller, would you like to contribute? What do you think about where the university sector is going to go in the next period and all the other issues that we've discussed?
I think if we were to look at the longer term, then what you've heard from the panel, which is to look at this issue from a different angle. What do we need in terms of skills, and what does Scotland and its sectors need? What's the best way of delivering that from a tertiary perspective, so that we're looking at colleges and universities, and then what are the models that are going to sustainably fund that for the future? So we're almost looking at it from a slightly different angle. I think in the short term, however, there are also some disincentives that could be removed that would make an impact. We've talked about clawback, but let me give you another example around how graduate apprenticeships work. There are a set of frameworks that exist, but they're quite limited in terms of the scope of where graduate apprenticeships can work. And they don't necessarily, in all instances, deliver the skills that are required. There are some, but not many, within the health service, for example, but there are quite a few workforce issues that could be solved using the graduate apprenticeship model. In my discussions with a number of local authorities, they told me there were two particular areas where they had real problems in recruitment and retention. One was in town planning and one was in social work. So if we leave social work aside at the moment, because there is now a mechanism in place for dealing with that, but we responded to that by developing what we are now having to call a workplace learning degree as opposed to a graduate apprenticeship, because there is no framework. And because there's no framework, we can't claim the £1,820 from SAS for the fee. So we set that up, as Professor Rigby mentioned. It takes time to set up a programme, and it took us a while to get that programme up and running. But we've now got, from January of this year, the first cohort of 20 employees from local authorities delivering a town planning qualification. So responding to the needs of an employer, but having to work around the mechanisms rather than having a mechanism that really makes that work is a bit of a frustration. So I think there are things that we need to look at in the longer term, there are things that can be done in the short term, and then there are medium-term fixes as well. But we must start from what does Scotland need from its tertiary education sector, then decide how it's going to be delivered, then decide how we are going to sustainably fund that.
Okay. Can I thank you specifically for answering all the questions just politely and clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. And I would like to start in a similar vein to how my colleague Willie Rennie finished, which is to say two things. Firstly, I think it's fair to say that students and staff at many institutions across Scotland are worried, and they're having what they think and believe in, and actually objectively looks like a pretty hard time, if I'm honest. And I think many of you have acknowledged that so far. I also would like to acknowledge the fact that our universities are some of the most leading and well-respected institutions in the world, and I genuinely appreciate the work that you and your staff teams across Scotland do for the country and for students attending them. I'm going to start with a question, if it's okay, for Professor Matheson, to go back to some of the points that we've heard earlier, if you will, around the particular situation in your circumstances at the University of Edinburgh. And we've done a lot of this, so I just want to get something kind of clear on the record. Trade unions have come to us and they've said that they didn't feel that there were many alternatives explored, or if there were alternatives explored, they didn't understand what they were, partly because they felt that they haven't had the information they need, partly because they're not sure that they've been explored at all. So could you set out just now for us what alternatives specifically have been explored to before getting to the conclusion that you've drawn, which is to reduce the staff?
Thanks very much for your initial remarks. Much appreciated, certainly by me and I'm sure by my colleagues. So in terms of the discussions with the trade unions, we have regular dialogue with the joint trade unions, and as you know, UCU represents all of our staff, whether or not they're members of UCU or not. So there is a kind of statutory engagement between my HR colleagues and often the leadership of the university, including me, with both UCU as the representative of all staff and also the joint trade unions as a group, UCU being mostly for academic staff. So that process of engagement carries on. We believe that we've been open and honest and transparent with those discussions. We've also shared information more broadly with our Senate and also with a number of all staff communications. Some of these is by email, some of it's by holding of town hall meetings, and some of it's by sort of question and answer sessions where people can come and ask whatever questions they want. So we do believe that there's been a process of transparency and engagement. The reality is that people don't like the information that they're seeing because it's unwelcome and it's threatening and they're worrying. So we recognise all of that, but we also have a job to do in terms of responsible leadership of the university. So we have calculated what we think the future income streams will deliver. That we do this, again, we do this constantly, but it's become particularly challenging in the last 2 or 3 years for all the reasons that we've already rehearsed. And so as part of that, we have considered what are the options for the university here. We could, for example, decide to close a school or a subject area that is not profitable if we were going to be driven by money alone. And we've consciously taken the decision not to do that. We want to remain a comprehensive university. We don't actually think radical changes in the subjects we offer are either necessary or desirable. We've considered all these things. We've had lots of discussions about these various things. We've contemplated what can we do with our estate? And again, that's been questions have been asked by other people. We know that we need to reduce the size of our estate. We know that we need to make it excuse me, from sustainable from climate perspective. So there's lots of work been going on for many years, long before I arrived and certainly since I arrived. There's nothing to do with the current financial consequences. So this is responsible leadership. This is what we're trying to do. The current imperative is that if we want to seek to not be the next University of Dundee and go into deficit and precipitate a crisis whereby we're having to make really radical and urgent decisions about how many people we employ, what subjects we offer, how are we going to be sustainable for the future. It's responsible leadership to not allow ourselves to get into that situation. What we see from the projections, and obviously all financial planning is based on projections and scenarios, what we see is that if we were to do nothing, we would end up in deficit, unable to invest in our future, unable to seize opportunities when they come along, unable to invest in the needs of our students and staff. We've made massive investments in the 7.5 years that I've been here, particularly in student experience, but also in staff experience. We're paying our staff better. We've revised our grade scales. We have no 0 hours contracts. We have improved maternity and paternity leave. We've done a number of things to try and make ourselves a better employer. All of these things have a price tag, and they have to be affordable. And so in order to make sure that the university is sustainable for the future, it is our belief that we need to take some of the costs out of our current operations. An alternative would be to just say, well, let's just take some more international students. We know we've got the applicants. We can do that. But where are they going to live? Where are they going to be studied? What's that going to do to our staff workloads? What's it going to do to the city? You know, we have a broader responsibility, not just to grow for growth's sake. And one of the things that I've had as a central part of the strategy since the day I arrived is that the University of Edinburgh will not grow for growth's sake. We think we're pretty big already. There has been some growth. Some of it was in relation to the pandemic, taking more students than we'd planned. Some of it has been kind of incremental growth because there are programs that we offer that are very popular, and so we get very good applications for them. So there has been a bit of growth, but it hasn't been growth driven by a financial imperative. So I think the answer is we have considered lots of alternatives. We've come to a plan. If we're going to reduce our expenditure, and 58% of our expenditure is on staff, it's kind of inescapable that some of the reductions we've got to make are going to be on staff. Otherwise, we're only looking at 42% of our expenditure, much of which is actually fixed for us, for example, on research, where research is basically money in and money out.
And I understand that, and you've spoken about responsible leadership and responsibilities, and you'll know that staff too will have responsibilities, not only to their subject, but also to their students and to their own personal circumstances, so their home and their life and and so they are finding it very, very difficult, particularly when they say to us that they're not privy to the information that you say you've given them. So we've got two sets of truths, I suppose, or two sets of circumstances that we are navigating as a committee to try and understand. As a way forward, would you consider meeting with the joint unions on the back of today's session to talk in more detail with them about the specific operating alternatives that you looked at, and discuss with them to, I think Ross Greer used the word, leave no stone unturned, and to wring as much out of every other area that you consider. And people understand the issues of liquidity, people understand the things that are fixed or not fixed. But would you commit to meeting again with them, to having that open dialogue, so that at the very least, if different decisions can be come to, great. If the same decisions can be come to, at least people feel that they've been included, they've been part of it, and in fact the obligations that you have legally as an employer have been carried out.
Yes, so as I've already said, we constantly, we meet on a regular schedule with the joint unions. We respond to requests for information. We have a finance SharePoint which is available to all members of the university, which has all the data, all the information, all the planning, everything that we are able to share is on there. It does, it's complex and it requires explanation sometimes. So some people are very accomplished at looking at spreadsheets and projections. Some people need more time to understand it and have it explained. We try and provide those opportunities, absolutely commit to those conversations continuing. Sometimes they involve me, sometimes they involve other members of the senior team, but there's a regular dialogue between the joint trade unions and the leadership of the university, and also importantly, I think, with the wider staff. We do recognise the role of the unions in representing the staff, but also there are some people that would rather hear the information directly themselves. So we have an ongoing programme of this kind of engagement. Unfortunately, we can't make the news welcome. We can't sugarcoat the situation.
I don't think, and I appreciate that, Professor Masson, and I don't think people are looking for it to be sugar-coated. I genuinely believe they want to see it without the sugar-coating, but they also want for you to hear what they have to say without their sugar-coating as well. And so I think that having that open dialogue, again, on the back of some of what's been discussed today, could go a long way to trying to come to the kind of joint solution that I think your students, your staff and your leadership and yourself want, which is a solution that means that the University of Edinburgh can continue to do the great work that it's doing for the region and for Scotland.
Absolutely. I mean, that's very much my intent and my team's intent, and I agree. That's what people in the university want. Everyone recognises what a powerful institution it is, and many people want to be part of it, and we're very grateful for that. So, yes, I absolutely agree that we can have those opportunities. I would just refer to a meeting that I was not present at, which was with the joint trade unions just last week. And I've heard from various colleagues and from the unions themselves that they consider that a very helpful meeting. It was a long meeting. They had the opportunity to dissect bits of information. They felt that they got information that they hadn't they hadn't at least understood before. Maybe they'd seen the numbers but not had them explained properly. So it's an ongoing process. What we have not seen is, either from the Senate or from the joint trade unions, any kind of concrete proposals as to what they would do differently. How would they address the system? You know, we've invited people to make suggestions to us. We're willing to listen to any ideas that we might not have, any stone that we might not have upturned. We think we've upturned all the stones, and we do think that the proposals we've got are deliverable and in the best interest of the institution. But we understand that it makes people uncomfortable and worried about their own livelihoods, and we fully accept that, which is why we want to do it in a transparent way as quickly as we can.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Professor Miller, one of the representations that I've had on the circumstance in your own university is that there's a disproportionate impact of some of the potential job losses in the social sciences division. And what's been put to me is that that's an area where a number of perhaps widening access students, mature students, first-time generation students are attending. What's your response to that concern?
The system that we put in place had 3 work streams, and one of the work streams was to look at the academic portfolio, and that's looked at a large number of metrics, including student demand. And what we did was to map where we had seen changes in student demand. So we had essentially 3 broad categories. One where there continued to be significant demand at significant scale. One where there was still a significant scale but demand was falling, and one where we saw a number where the scale was low and the demand was low. So as I was mentioning earlier, we were very clear in setting this out. We needed to target where we had seen the largest drop in student numbers. And across the schools, we have 4 schools, and across the schools the numbers varied quite significantly. And where we have identified the changes that are required, it is proportionate to the reduction that we've seen in student numbers and ongoing student demand. So there isn't a straightforward, it's here or it's here. It's proportionate to where we've seen the reduction in the number of students and the likelihood of future demand, rather than across the whole institution. Across the whole institution, there will be students who are first in family. 45% of our students are still the first in family to come to university. 60% of our students are female. 65% of our students are mature students. So they are spread across all aspects of on all programmes. But where we have identified those changes that are required, it's a number of metrics, one of which is the student demand and the student numbers.
And can I ask, have you done any sort of impact assessment of the decision?
Yes, so the final business case, which is now published in the same way that Professor Matheson mentioned, we have a SharePoint site that anybody can access the information, and there is an equality impact assessment on the full business case, and it is there. And again, just like Professor Matheson, not only are we engaging with our trade union colleagues around this, I started that process with confidential briefings well before Christmas, so that they would understand actually what was coming down the line, because we didn't really know at that point the size of the issue that we might be facing. And of course, there were some things in the year, like the national insurance contributions, that threw our plans awry, which meant we had to go back and look at it again. So we started very early with both our recognised and non-recognised trade unions. They were involved in the process that we put in place. Unfortunately, they decided that they couldn't continue to be part of that and withdrew. On Monday of this week, I met with them with the recognised trade unions, and we are now hopefully getting that back on track. So we've had a bit of a rocky path, but hopefully we're back to a more stable position. Over and above that, I have an all-staff meeting, a hybrid meeting, every month. Every member of staff is invited to come along to that. We do it on different days, at different times, and on different campuses to ensure that we get that spread. This has been a constant topic throughout. I meet with every school division and every professional services and support services department at least once a year, so they have the opportunity to ask me directly any questions that they may have. And we also have a mechanism of core brief where we have a dissemination of information. So whether we're doing it directly with staff representatives, we also have an employee forum, which we use for that mechanism as well, and a number of other communication schemes, which again I think you would expect and you will see across virtually every university, not just in Scotland but in the United Kingdom, to ensure that we are as open and as transparent as we can be.
Thank you. And on the impact assessment, very, very briefly, if staff or trade unions and their representatives see any questions or concerns that they have about the impact assessment, is that something that you'd be prepared to discuss with them?
There's an open invitation to do that, absolutely. But I would also say we need to move beyond the fact that we've put an impact assessment together. Of course, we would do that, but actually, once we get into the granular level of detail around where these jobs might fall, we need to look at that again as well, and that's why we will do it through that consultation process that I mentioned earlier on. So there will be multiple opportunities to do that.
Thank you. I think that kind of revisiting when more is known is really welcome. I have one very final question, and it's probably for Claire Macpherson and Professor Rigby. I'm struck by the evidence that you submitted from University of Scotland that spoke about the biggest issue being the underfunding of the sector and the levelling down of public funding. And by what you said, Professor Rigby, about almost a kind of worst of both worlds in terms of the operating environment the universities are in. Can I ask, of all the things that universities are being asked to do just now through the SFC and their allocations and protect student widening access, to protect Scottish domiciled students' experience, to enhance research, are universities really being asked to do the impossible with the resources and the model that they have?
I'll start, and perhaps Professor Rigby can come in. I think what we've heard over the course of this morning, and I guess what the reality of the situation the sector is facing is, quite rightly, there's been lots of questions about decisions that are being made at an institutional level that impact on jobs and impact on provision. But that is the direct consequence of the structural underfunding issue that we've evidenced. So there's a huge desire to continue to deliver around agendas like widening access, to make economic contributions to support the public service workforce. I don't think they are burdens on the sector, because these are things that the institutions actively want to do. But against the backdrop of extremely challenging financial trajectory, and particularly the level of public funding over the last decade, those things are harder to do, and the money that we have available to do them is obviously reducing, and that means that some of the more difficult choices that we've heard about this morning have to be made. No one wants to be in a position where you're reducing staff numbers, closing provision, and thinking about, I guess, taking a step back from some of the ambitions you have in terms of the contribution the sector wants to make. But that's the natural consequence of the long-term downward turn in public funding. And it's not a position anyone wants to be in, but it is the position we are in.
Thank you. Professor Rigby.
Yeah, is my job impossible? Probably. What I would say is that there are clear ambitions for higher education in Scotland, and they're enumerated in many ways through those kind of recording mechanisms of the Scottish Funding Council. So, of course, as Claire said, we want to extend widening participation as far as it can go. And it's right that we should be called to account on that. A whole load of other things fall into that category. But what tends to happen in any system over time is an accrual of need, an accrual of reporting mechanism. And I think we're right now to rethink, reset, and not to regard a failure to meet some of those metrics as a careless act on the part of a university, but sometimes as part of the fact that we are unable to service all of the elements of our mission to the extent that we would wish, because we are so preoccupied with trying to keep the financial show on the road. I mean, I know this is a committee about financial sustainability, but if you were an alien and you looked at the university through this lens, all it does is spend money and not bring enough income. And the huge benefits that we bring, we as a senior team may not be able to put enough effort into that, because we're putting so much effort into cheese-paring bits of money to keep our staff on board. So I think there are two things that could really help with that. And one would be to have a look almost from ground zero about what reporting we actually care about and what that should deliver in terms of reassurance that money is being well spent in the Scottish sector. And then a real advocation, you can't advocate, can't we? A real sense that universities should be engaging with positive change and not just trying to retain a status quo that's flowing away from us.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Professor Masson, can I come back to you in terms of the Senate vote of no confidence in yourself and the Executive? To your knowledge, has that happened before? Is this the first time that such a decision has been taken?
I'm just waiting for the light.
Yep.
At the University of Edinburgh, certainly in my time there, it's the first time. You've seen similar votes in other universities across the UK. At the moment, it's happening quite a lot. So it's a serious expression of opinion. We recognise that. We engage with our Senate in the same way in which we've tried to be transparent with the whole of the staff. We've directed information at the Senate. We've had a special meeting with the Senate to try and make sure they have the opportunity to ask questions. A group of the Senate members put together a paper assessing what they thought was the impact of the steps we've already taken. I would say that paper did not contain any suggestions about alternative approaches. It contained a lot of expression of concern, and we recognise that. But Senate's been invited. Senate obviously is a large group of highly intelligent people, highly committed to the university, and we've invited them to engage with us and to think about other ways of addressing the situation, and that offer remains open. So there's an ongoing process of discussion with Senate. In terms of the impact of the vote, it has already been reported to the Executive, so it was a vote of confidence or lack of it in the Executive, which is the larger group that I chair. That group is meeting actually this week. But the result of the vote's already been reported to the Executive. There's quite a bit of crossover of membership, so it didn't come as news. It's also been reported to the Court, to the governing body, and there'll be an opportunity for both Executive and Court to discuss the vote and what difference what should we do differently as a way of responding to that vote. That's an ongoing process.
And do you think you should do something differently, given it's unprecedented in your time as principal? And our understanding from the submission that you've seen, that on the 26th of March, the Senate expressed deep concern about the impact of the proposed cut of 140 million over 18 months. But the no confidence vote was taken as the Senate's concerns had not been addressed by the University Executive. So this was not a knee-jerk reaction. There was almost 2 months from one meeting to another where there was an opportunity for you to address the concerns of the Senate, and clearly they believed nothing had been done because they went ahead with the vote and stated they had no confidence in you and the Executive.
Yeah, so you're right on those dates. It's not correct that nothing was done. I mean, we convened a special meeting of Senate in that period to try and give them an opportunity to ask us questions and have them answered. And that meeting was, I think, very constructive. And actually, everybody felt that it was a useful exercise.
But even after that, they still voted they had no confidence.
They did.
So the question is, what does that vote of no confidence, a significant, unprecedented in your time as principal, achieve now? Going to use the principle to the Court, to the Executive, what will that vote of no confidence mean?
So it shows us that the Senate is regarded as the kind of supreme academic body of the university, so it's made up of academic staff and a very large number of students as well. And it shows us that group, the vote was about 2/3, 1/3, so a majority of that group believes that the approach that the University Executive is taking to address our financial situations is not the one that they would choose. We have invited them to tell us, well, what would they do? I think there is an acceptance at Senate and actually by the joint trade unions and in fact by the university as a whole, and also by SFC and politicians and media and everyone. There is an acceptance that there's a problem that we need to address. What people don't like is the scale of the change and the pace of the change. And we've tried very hard to justify both of those things and will continue to do so.
Do you understand that in response to Miles Briggs, you were saying the pace of the change, in your view, was right to stop people being worried? But there's also a concern that the pace of the change you're going at prevents other ideas coming forward. You're not allowing time for these other ideas to be developed and to be put to you, to be considered and potentially adopted, to go back to Mr Greer's point, to look at these other stones that may be unturned.
Yeah, I mean, we have had for months now and still have an opportunity for people to come forward with suggestions. Part of the SharePoint, a bit like as James was saying at at UWS, there's an opportunity for people to ask questions if there's some information they feel they lack, is there something else that they need to know, or indeed if they've got suggestions about alternative proposals to come forward with them. We've not seen those. We've not had alternative proposals put to us. What people would wish, I think, is for us to. They say things like, I've had the suggestion, just recruit more international students. I've explained why we don't think that's the right answer. They say, sell your buildings or stop building new buildings. And again, I've explained why we don't think that's the answer. So there are suggestions about how else we could address the finances of the university, but they don't address the underlying problem, which is that the university currently, on current projections, is living beyond its means. And as responsible leaders, the ones that currently bear the responsibility of being the principal and the senior team and the executive have a plan to address that, which has been agreed and discussed with our court, as we've said, and indeed with the Scottish Funding Council. That's the proposal, unless someone comes up with a better idea.
And what detailed economic modelling have you done on the impact of these cuts on the city of Edinburgh? Because we've heard, well, you can't put a number on how many job losses. We've got to use the predictions that have been made. That could be 1 in 15 people employed here in Edinburgh. And what economic assessment have you made about the future impact, the future income of the university as regards to your proposals?
So we've also done impact assessments around aspects of equality and diversity.
I understand impact assessments because you have to do them. What about the economic assessments?
If you allow me to finish,
are they available?
If you allow me to finish, I'll answer
Please.
that. So the economic impact of the changes is absolutely part of our consideration. We've also done the exercise that James referred to of looking to see where there's demand and where there's not. If a lot of our ability to recruit numbers of students to make courses sustainable depends on student demand. So we've got a lot of analysis of demand and trends over years. And we've also identified a very large number. And Edinburgh offers massive choice, huge numbers of courses. And we've identified hundreds of courses for which there's almost no demand. And so it doesn't make sense to continue to provide those. For most of them, there's an alternative. And obviously, any students that are currently on any of these programs, their course will be taught and will be honoured. So no current student will be displaced. But there are some programs that we will close to new entrants because they're not viable, because there's not enough demand. So we're doing exactly the same kind of analysis. In terms of the impact on the city, this is something that we are a big employer, as you say. We recognise that many of the local MSPs will have their constituents as part of the staff or the student body. We have seen growth in the staff numbers, as you've also referred to. So we've created lots of jobs in the last few years. The university has grown massively compared to sort of 20, 25 years ago. So it's much bigger now than it was. So there's been a lot of creation of employment. Now that has to be reset because that speed of growth is not affordable. And so there is a reset required. There will be some people that will be looking for jobs elsewhere in the sector or outside the sector. We recognise the reality of that. We want to be clear and transparent about why, and we want to be a good employer in terms of the people that we continue to employ. So, yes, there will be likelihood of some job losses. Again, hoping, as others have said, that we don't have to resort to compulsory redundancies. It's absolutely part of our policies that that's only a last resort. We try and do everything by voluntary means if we can. And people will either move out of the sector or decide to stop work or whatever their decisions they will make. That does have an impact, but we also recognise that in the longer term, the University of Edinburgh is a really important part of the city. It has to be sustainable. It has to be here for the next 442 years. And if we're careless with the finances, we run the risk of that not being the case.
Do you genuinely believe to make £90 million of savings in staff alone, you can do that without compulsory redundancies?
I don't know. I hope so. We will do the same kind of exercise that James described.
What Professor Miller is doing, and your scales are both different, but I think it's 65 or 75 jobs he's looking at. We don't know how many jobs you're looking at, but you must accept to get to 90 million, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to rely solely on voluntary redundancies if your first tranche has got you 350.
So the reality is that that's precisely the reason why we've not felt able to rule out compulsory redundancies, because we don't know. Voluntary redundancies or voluntary severance depends on people's willingness to come forward. We provided a package. We actually extended the deadline. We did have a large number of applications and we've accepted most of them. So that's been an exercise that has yielded voluntary reduction in staff numbers. We could certainly do that again, but we would be likely to do so in a more targeted way for exactly the reasons you've heard. We need to identify where we need staff and where we don't. Where can we manage with fewer staff without damaging the mission of the university? And then we would target a process of discussions with a group of staff as to how we're going to achieve the change that we need to achieve. That can include voluntary packages, and if those fail, we might in the end have to resort to compulsory redundancies. But it's not absolutely a matter of policy that we inevitably will have compulsory redundancies. The matter of policy is we'll try and avoid them if we can.
And on that economic modelling, so that you accept there'll be impacts on the city and you accept there'll be impacts on the university, will that be published, provided, very publicly open for people to scrutinise your economic modelling about the impact of your proposals?
The modelling that we work on is, I mean, all of the modelling of the finances of the university and the changes that we're seeking to make is part of the SharePoint I've referred to, so that's available. Obviously,
so just check, would you provide that economic modelling to this committee to look at?
I'd have to check with my colleagues as to exactly what we've got in a form that could be shared with the committee, but I'll certainly explore that question with them.
But you've accepted, you have done the economic modelling on the impact of your decisions, your proposals.
We've done an analysis of risks and benefits, and those include economic risks and benefits. Yes, I don't know that we've done any very sophisticated modelling on the impact of the city on the city. It's a reasonable point which I can certainly discuss with my colleagues, and I would certainly be happy to share anything that we're able to share with the committee.
Okay, there's a number of things we'd be great for. Would you benefit from further parliamentary scrutiny of your plans, do you think?
Would I benefit, or would the university benefit?
Well, both, perhaps.
I think we're a publicly funded organisation. We accept that there's a public interest in how we prioritise and the decisions we make. So I think there's a lot of scrutiny already through the Scottish Funding Council and through various other mechanisms. So I don't think we lack scrutiny, but obviously if Parliament seeks to ask us questions, we will do our best to answer them. And
only because you introduced it. What about you personally? Would you benefit from that?
Benefit from further scrutiny?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've come here this morning, I've tried to answer your questions.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's helpful for you to go away and consider some of the points Ms Duncan-Glancy and others have raised with you?
I'm always willing to listen to constructive comment and advice, yes.
Okay. Finally, from me, you've been in post 7.5 years, I think you said. You're bringing forward very unpopular proposals. Are you the right person to take the University of Edinburgh forward into the future? And are you committed to the future, continuing on as principal for some years to come?
Well, my term of office is 5 years. My term of office when I was appointed was 5 years, and then the university appointed me to a second 5-year term, so I have 2.5 years left on that term. And obviously what happens after that is a matter for the discussions with the court. I consider that I'm able to do what needs doing, and I'm willing to do it, and I've got a team of people around me that are capable of delivering what I believe is in the best interest of the university. So certainly for the foreseeable future, I don't see that changing.
Okay. Can I thank you all for your time today and your answers? There's a number of points you said you'd come back to us on. I think the only one I didn't note down was you, Professor Rigby, so you're the only one that's got no further work from this session, but we would be keen to get that as quickly as possible on a number of the points that were raised. I'm going to continue our deliberations, just to go through a couple of SIs. So the next item, but you're free to go. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is consideration of 4 items of subordinate legislation. The first is SI 2025-555. The Scotland Act 1998, Agency Arrangement Specification Recognition of Qualifications Order 2025. This instrument is being considered under the negative procedure. Do members have any comments to make about this? John Mason.
Yes, really, just a comment rather than I don't disagree with what's actually happening in this SSI, but I think there is an issue about recognising overseas qualifications, and particularly it's come up in relation to some of the people who have come from Ukraine, but other countries as well. And some of them have got very good qualifications, it appears, in their own country, and they're finding it very difficult to be accepted here and have their qualifications either improved or recognised. So I just make that as a comment that I think it's something we or somebody should be looking at in the future, but I don't object to the SSI.
Okay, with that comment, is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. The second instrument is SSI 2025-144, the Education Appeals Committee Procedure Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025. This has been considered under the negative procedure. I should say the DPLR committee met yesterday to consider this and did recommend some drafting changes. But apart from that, do members have any comments they wish to make about this instrument? Is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? It is. We'll now look at our third instrument, SSI 2025-151, the St Mary's Music School Aided Places Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025. This instrument is being considered under the negative procedure. Do members have any comments to make about this instrument? No. Is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. And the final instrument today is SSI 2025-152, the Teachers' Pension Scheme Scotland Amendment 2025. This instrument is being considered under the negative procedure. Like the earlier one, this was considered by DPLR committee yesterday, and they have also made drafting recommendations to this SSI. But do members have any comments they wish to make about this instrument? No. Is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. That concludes the public part of our proceedings. The committee will now move into private session to consider its final agenda items, and I suspend this meeting for about 10 minutes. Thank you.